before the age of fingerprints, before criminal profiling, before the world even had a word for what he was. He was already done killing, already gone, already a ghost swallowed by a river that never gave him back. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling cases where the truth hid beneath what first appeared completely harmless. This story came together through many hours of careful research and thoughtful work. Every detail was included with purpose, to create an immersive experience while treating these real events with the respect they deserve. This channel exists to keep these stories alive and make sure they are never forgotten. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the ghost of S.A. with Tildio Paulo's coffee fields. He murdered over 50 souls across the Brazilian wilderness, and then simply vanished. This is the case of Diogo Figueira da Rocha, aka Diaguinho, the little devil of the interior. Now let's begin. Somewhere deep in the red-soiled coffee country of late 19th century Brazil, a man with a surveyor's education and a killer's patience sat in the long afternoon shadows of the Mogiana region. His hunting dog curled at his feet, his machete resting across his knee, and his body count quietly climbing past 50. His name was Diogo Figueira da Rocha, though the terrified farmers, the trembling widows, and the government detectives who chased him through jungle paths and riverbanks knew him by something else entirely. Diaguinho. Little Diogo. A name that sounds almost tender, almost harmless, like something a grandmother might whisper to a child at bedtime. Except no grandmother in the state of São Paulo whispered that name at bedtime. She whispered it to make the child go silent, to make the child stop moving, because the mere sound of it was enough to drain the color from a grown man's face and send women bolting the shutters before dusk had even fully settled. He was not a large man. He was not a towering monster carved from nightmares. He was ordinary-looking, wiry, and educated, a man who had once measured land for a living. And yet, between 1894 and 1897, in a 3-year rampage that left more than 50 confirmed corpses scattered across farms, railway stops, riverbanks, and dirt roads, Diaguinho became the most feared name in the entirety of the Brazilian interior. He killed for money. He killed for pride. He killed over a crushed straw hat. He killed because someone looked at him the wrong way at a dance, and by the time the music stopped, that someone was no longer breathing. The state of São Paulo eventually sent an entire government task force to find him. They hunted him for months through dense scrubland and swollen rivers. And when they finally cornered him on the banks of the Mogiana River on the 1st of May, 1897, they fired their weapons, watched a body fall into the dark water, and never found it again. Was Diaguinho dead? Or had the most prolific killer in São Paulo's history simply done what he had always done? Disappeared into the landscape, leaving behind nothing but dread and silence and the unshakable feeling that he was still out there somewhere. Watching? This is that story, and it does not end the way you think it does. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There is something about the interior of São Paulo in the latter half of the 19th century that needs to be understood before anything else. It was not a civilized place in any comfortable sense of that word. It was raw. It was vast. It was governed more by the personal authority of wealthy land-owning colonels, the Coronius, than by any distant apparatus of law. Police stations were sparse, poorly staffed, and often in the quiet employment of the same powerful men who owned the coffee plantations stretching endlessly across the red earth. Justice in that world was largely a private matter. A man with the right connections could bury a crime as easily as he buried a seed. And a man with neither connections nor patience could bury another man without any meaningful consequence at all, provided he chose his victim from the right social level and his timing was discreet enough. It was into this world, this sun-scorched, dust-choked, morally elastic world, that Diogo Figueira de Rocha was born on the 9th of October, 1863, in the town of Botucatu, in the São Paulo province of the Brazilian Empire. His father was a man called Arvelino Rocha, and his mother was Armelinda Figueira, a seamstress and a benzedeira, which in the Brazilian rural tradition meant a woman who performed folk blessings and prayers, a healer of sorts, someone the neighbors trusted and came to in moments of trouble. There was nothing obviously corrupted in that household. It was not a home of violence or deprivation in the way that one might expect from the origin story of Brazil's most feared killer. The father had some standing. The family had enough. Diogo attended the local school, the Escola Botucatuense, and by the accounts of those who later wrote about him, he was a capable student, sharp-minded, quick to absorb information. He was also quick to fight. Even as a schoolboy, he had a temper that surfaced without warning and vanished just as fast. A cold, mechanical anger that didn't escalate into shouting, but instead moved directly into action. He hit, he struck. He walked away and seemed to feel nothing about it afterward. By the time he was 15, school was behind him, and he found work with engineers and land surveying teams employed by the expanding railway companies threading their iron lines across the interior of São Paulo. It was precise, physical, outdoor work, perfect for a young man who struggled with confined spaces and authority. He learned the trade thoroughly. He became, by his early 20s, a qualified land surveyor or agrimensor, which in that era was a respectable occupation, one that required mathematical literacy, an understanding of terrain, and the ability to work with wealthy clients who needed their properties measured and legally documented. He carried measuring chains and paper and a certain professional dignity. He moved through the countryside. He learned its roads, its rivers, its hidden paths. He learned which farms connected to which, and which stretches of wilderness had no witnesses. He married a woman named Antonia de Mello in the town of Itatinga, and for a time the shape of his life appeared to follow the expected trajectory. He worked. He had a wife. He took on employment at a lamp factory owned by his brother-in-law, a man named Antonio Canrardelli, though he never abandoned surveying entirely. The coffee economy was booming. The railway lines kept expanding westward. There was always work for a man who could read land and draw straight lines. But the straight lines never held for Diogo. Not for long. The accounts of what turned him toward killing, what that first rupture was, what cracked the ordinary surface of his life and let the violence beneath pour through, are somewhat tangled, worn smooth by decades of retelling, polished into different shapes by different hands. The most persistent version in the popular imagination goes like this: that Diogo fell into a consuming passion for a young woman named Mariquinha, the daughter of a wealthy and powerful landowner known as Colonel Thomas Fernandes. The colonel, in the way of powerful men who believe their daughters are worth more than the men who want them, prohibited the relationship entirely. He looked at Diogo, the surveyor, the lamp factory worker, the man who did not own land but merely measured it, and decided he was not sufficient. The prohibition was delivered not as a request but as a fact. The matter was closed. But something happened on the day that Colonel Thomas made this prohibition clear, something that went beyond wounded pride and rejection. According to the telling that survived longest in the region's collective memory, it did not end with words. Diogo was seized. He was beaten. And in an act of humiliation so complete, so deliberately degrading, that it erased every ordinary layer of his identity in a single terrible afternoon, he was castrated and left tied to a tree at the edge of the colonel's land, hanging in agony above the banks of the Magi Guatsu River, left there to die from shock and bleeding and shame. He did not die. How he survived, who cut him down, how long he hung there before someone found him. Those details did not survive in any reliable written record. What survived was only the aftermath. He healed. And whatever Diogo Figueira de Rocha had been before that tree, whatever ambitions and ordinary hungers had guided him, whatever remained of the careful professional surveyor who carried measuring chains and paperwork, all of it was gone. What stepped down from that tree and walked back into the world was something else entirely. Something that had concluded with absolute and unshakable certainty that it had nothing left to lose. Something that now applied the same cold, mathematical precision it had once used to measure land to an entirely different purpose. It is worth noting that some historians who examined his case in later years pushed back against this origin story. They argued that the violence in Diogo preceded any romance, that his first killing was not vengeance for a mutilation but simply an impulse, an eruption of rage that needed no wound to provoke it and no injustice to justify it. They pointed to his school fights, to the pattern of volatility that appeared well before any woman or colonel entered the story. They said Diogo did not become dangerous because someone hurt him. He was always dangerous, and someone hurting him simply removed the last reason he had to restrain himself. Both things may be true at once. What we know with certainty is that the first documented killing came relatively early in his adulthood, and it did involve the colonel. The accounts place Diogo at a rooster-fighting gathering in Bachicatu, a rinha de gallo, a cockfight, which in that time and place was a social event, a place where men gathered and drank and placed money on birds tearing each other apart. Colonel Thomas Fernandez was there, watching his birds fight with the comfort of a man who owned things. Diogo approached him. What was said between them, or whether anything was said at all, depends entirely on who recorded the story. What followed was not a duel, not a confrontation between equals, not any kind of encounter the colonel had been prepared for. It was swift, conclusive, and one-sided. The colonel died. Diogo walked away. He was 20-something. The colonel was dead, and the machinery that would produce more than 50 more bodies had been set into motion. The second killing followed the logic of the first, not police logic, not the logic of investigation or arrest, but the internal logic of a man who had now killed and had not been stopped. His niece had fallen in love with a young man in the area, and that young man, finding himself not ready or not willing for the weight of what she offered, had done what frightened young men do. He had slipped away, left without a proper answer, avoided the discomfort of a real ending. In another family, in another world, this would have been a wound of the ordinary kind, the kind that heals slowly and leaves only a faint scar. In the Rocha family, it became something else. Diogo located the young man one night as he was leaving a bar. The night was dark. The road was empty. And Diogo, who was by all accounts physically strong despite not being exceptionally large, beat the young man to death with a wooden club, striking him across the skull and across the body with the concentrated, unhurried efficiency of someone completing a task they have decided must be completed. There was no argument, no chance to explain or apologize or run. Just the sudden end of a life on a dark road, and Diogo walking away again with his dog trotting at his heels, and the night closing back over the place where a body now cooled in the dirt. After this second killing, the pattern of Diogo's existence changed decisively. He had already left any possibility of a normal life behind after the colonel's death. A man does not kill a powerful landowner and continue surveying land for a living in the same region. But now, with a second death attached to his name, he was fully outside the bounds of ordinary society. He became what the Brazilian interior had always had a category for: the bandido, the outlaw, the man who lived outside walls and slept in different places and moved through the landscape like weather, appearing and disappearing without warning. He formed a loose band of associates, men who, for various reasons of their own, had also stepped beyond what the law permitted. And from that band, operating out of the Mogiana region, sheltered by a network of wealthy fazenderos who found him useful and feared him too much to refuse, he began to operate as what would today be called a sicario, a contract killer, a hired instrument of death available to any man with land, money, a grievance, and the willingness to pay. The commercial architecture of his killing career is important to understand because it explains the sheer volume of deaths that accumulated around him. Diogo was not a lone predator selecting victims from personal compulsion alone, though personal compulsion was also abundantly present. He was embedded in a system. The coffee country Coronius had enemies: rival landowners, difficult tenants, inconvenient witnesses, labor organizers, men who owed money and could not pay, men who were owed money and demanded it too loudly. Disputes over land boundaries, which were frequent in a region where the same land was often claimed by multiple parties with conflicting paperwork, could be resolved not through courts but through a more direct method. A man who could survey land was also, in the most terrible irony, a man who understood which parcels of earth were disputed, which families were vulnerable, which conflict had been simmering long enough that someone might pay to end it permanently. Daiguinho was that resolution. He was the ending that money could purchase, but he was never purely transactional. The personal killings continued alongside the contracted ones, and this is where the horror of his story moves from the systemic to something more unsettling, because the triggers for his personal violence were so ordinary, so absurdly small, that they revealed something about the internal landscape of the man that no amount of origin story tragedy fully explains. He killed over an insult at a dance. He killed because a stranger unknowingly sat on his new straw hat at a social gathering, crushing it, and Daiguinho, who had worn that hat with the particular pride of a man for whom small dignities were the last remaining ones, did not shout, did not demand compensation, did not make a scene. He waited. He found the man later, and he killed him, over a hat. The dog was always there. A hunting dog, a bird dog, trained to flush perdiz from the scrubland, that accompanied him everywhere, that slept where he slept and moved where he moved. When people later described their encounters with Daiguinho on the roads of the interior, when the rare surviving witness described the moment they saw him approaching and their blood went cold, they almost always mentioned the dog. It became part of the image. The wiry man with the machete and the firearm and the measuring man's eye for distance and angle, and the dog trotting beside him, placid and obedient, as if the two of them together were something entirely natural moving through the landscape, which in a terrible way they were. He was as natural to that landscape as drought, as flood, as the silent, murderous things that lived in the water and the undergrowth. He had become a feature of the terrain. By the time 1894 arrived, the year that historians and police records formally identify as the beginning of his most intensive killing period, Daiguinho was already known, already feared, already the subject of whispered warnings passed between farmers on market days, between women drawing water from wells, between railway workers pausing their hammering to watch a stranger approach along the track. He was 30 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade becoming this. And now, in the 3 years that remained to him, or that history officially assigns to him, he would add over 50 names to a list that still does not have all its entries confirmed, because in the red-soiled silence of the Brazilian interior in the 1890s, not every body was found, not every death was reported, and not every killing left a record anywhere except in the memory of whoever had been unfortunate enough to witness it and wise enough to stay silent afterward. He moved through the coffee country like something between a shadow and a storm. He crossed borders between townships. He appeared in places where he was not expected. He vanished before the local authorities, such as they were, could organize any meaningful response. And the wealthy men who sheltered him, the fazenderos with their broad verandas and their coffee-stained ledgers and their complicated relationships with violence as a management tool, continued to offer him food, shelter, and silence in exchange for his proximity, his protection, and his willingness to do what they needed done without paperwork or witnesses. The state of São Paulo was, by the mid-1890s, beginning to be embarrassed. The republic was new. Brazil had only abolished the monarchy in 1889 and declared itself a republic, and the young government was keenly aware of how it appeared to a watching world. A man who had murdered 50 people wandering freely through one of its most economically productive states, sheltered by its most powerful citizens, was not the image of modern, ordered nationhood that anyone wanted to project. The pressure to do something real, something final, something that would end the Daiguinho story before it became entirely unmanageable, was building. And it would eventually produce a response. But not yet. Not in 1894. In 1894, Daiguinho was at the peak of what he was. And what he was the most dangerous thing alive in the whole of that long, red, coffee-scented countryside. Understanding how Daiguinho operated during his peak years requires understanding the geography that sheltered him. The Mogiana region, named for the Estrada de Ferro Mogiana, the railway line that cut through it, connecting the coffee-producing interior to the ports and markets of the coast, was a specific kind of place. It was dense with coffee farms. It was threaded with rivers. Its boundaries overlapped several different comarcas, or judicial districts, which meant that a man who committed a crime in one district and fled into another existed, for practical purposes, in a jurisdictional gap. Local police in one area had no authority in the next. The machinery of coordination required to chase someone across those boundaries barely existed in 1894 and would not be properly assembled until the state government authorized the Special Task Force in 1897. Until then, Diaguinho had something that every successful predator requires: space to operate without consistent pursuit. He also had something else, something more psychologically complex and more revealing of the world he inhabited. He had community. Not the community of ordinary citizens who admired him out of abstract Robin Hood mythology, though that mythology would attach itself to his name posthumously and dishonestly. The community that sheltered him was the community of the powerful and the complicit. The wealthy landowners who employed his services paid for those services in shelter and silence and food and occasionally in money. They knew what he was. They knew the full account of what he had done. And they chose, repeatedly, deliberately, to keep him close because a man who killed without compunction and without leaving clean evidence was a useful instrument in a landscape where land disputes were settled with violence and labor was controlled through fear. It is worth examining some of the specific incidents that accumulated into the death toll of 50+, because each one reveals something different about the machinery of his violence. There was the killing of Marceliano Pereira Machado, known locally as Marceliano Fogatero, Marceliano the fireworks maker. This death was a contract killing in its purest form. A merchant named Manuel Ferreira, consumed by jealousy over a beautiful, strong-willed woman named Balbina who had a romantic involvement with Marceliano, approached Diaguinho and made a simple commercial proposal. He wanted Marceliano dead. He was willing to pay. The amount was agreed upon. The method was Diaguinho's to choose, as it always was, because part of what he sold was not just the killing but the confidence that it would be done cleanly, that there would be no witnesses left to speak. Marceliano was shot in the back. He was stepping off a train at a railway station near the region when Diaguinho, who had positioned himself with the careful spatial awareness of a man trained to understand angles and distances and lines of sight, fired from behind. The shot was not theatrical. It was not a confrontation between men who faced each other. It was a bullet in the back, a crumpling of the body onto the station platform, and Diaguinho was already moving before the echo of the shot had finished traveling. But then something happened that illustrated how Diaguinho's violence was never entirely contained within its commercial boundaries. Balbina, the woman over whom Marceliano had died, was present or nearby or accessible to the men of Diaguinho's band in the aftermath. His companions, not Diaguinho himself by most accounts, turned on her. They beat her brutally, leaving her alive but shattered, sending her fleeing toward Casablanca and eventually toward the capital to make a formal complaint. A complaint that, with startling courage given that the local authorities were either indifferent or quietly aligned with the same powerful men who employed her lover's killer, she actually made. She went to Sao Paulo City. She reported what had happened. And in doing so, she gave the state government one of its clearest early formal accounts of what Diaguinho actually was and where he operated. The complaint didn't stop him immediately, but it added another stone to the growing weight of evidence that would eventually, force a real response. Meanwhile, the killings continued with a variety and frequency that suggests a man for whom murder had genuinely ceased to carry any psychological friction. There was no hesitation in him, no evidence of the dread or guilt or dark reckoning that crime writers and psychologists like to locate in their subjects as proof of lingering humanity. Diaguinho killed and then ate his dinner. He killed and then attended a local dance. He killed and then slept deeply with his dog beside him on whatever farmhouse floor or jungle clearing he had chosen for the night. The straw hat killing deserves its full retelling here because it encapsulates something essential about his psychology. He had acquired a new hat, one of the wide-brimmed straw hats common to men working in the open sun of the Brazilian interior, and he wore it with the particular satisfaction of someone for whom material goods carried personal significance. At a social gathering, a dance or a public event, accounts vary. A man who did not know Diaguinho, who had no idea who was sitting near him or what that man's reputation was, made the simple, careless, utterly forgivable mistake of sitting on it. The hat was crushed. The man apologized, presumably, or perhaps didn't notice at all. It was an accident, the kind of thoughtless moment that happens in crowded spaces, the kind that two strangers laugh about and forget within minutes. Diaguinho did not forget it within minutes. He did not forget it within days. He found the man later, with deliberateness, after calculation, after allowing enough time to pass that the connection between the killing and the hat would not be immediately obvious to anyone who found the body. And he killed him, for a hat, for the insult to the dignity that the hat represented. For the same reason that a man who has been stripped of his bodily integrity and tied to a tree and left to die will calculate every subsequent slight against him with an accountant's precision and extract from the world an interest payment in blood. He was also killing men on behalf of others for reasons that seem, from a distance of a century and a quarter, almost surreal in their pettiness. Land disputes were the most common commercial justification. A farmer who wanted a neighbor's property and couldn't get it through legal means could pay Diaguinho to remove the obstacle. A merchant who was owed money by someone too powerful to sue through ordinary channels could pay to have that someone made unavailable for future debts. A man who had been publicly humiliated, whose wife had been looked at too long or whose cattle had been quietly moved across an unmarked boundary in the night, could purchase the particular satisfaction of a permanent resolution. The methods he used were not uniform. Firearms were common. He was an accurate shot and understood the importance of distance. The wooden club or garrote appears in multiple accounts of his personal killings, suggesting a preference for close-range violence when the killing felt personal, when he wanted the experience of it to be immediate and physical rather than managed from a distance. The machete was a constant presence, the Brazilian interior's tool of all purposes, for cutting cane and clearing brush and, when necessary, for the efficient termination of a man's presence in the world. He was not a torturer by the accounts that survive. His killings were not prolonged or sadistic in the theatrical sense. They were efficient. They were conclusive. He did not linger over them. He completed them and moved on, with the brisk, task-oriented manner of a man who had appointments elsewhere. There were multiple members of his loose band at various points. Men who aided him, sheltered him, committed violence alongside him or at his direction. Some of these men died during the hunts organized against him. Some were arrested in the aftermath of the 1897 operation and were held as accomplices. Several prominent fazenderos were eventually named in police investigations as having knowingly harbored and assisted him, and the subsequent legal proceedings, which the São Paulo Court of Justice ultimately resolved largely in the accused fazendero's favor, on the basis that complicity charges required proof of the primary crime, and the primary criminal was dead or presumed so, illustrated with uncomfortable clarity the extent to which Diaguinho's career had been embedded in the social and economic architecture of the region rather than simply flourishing in spite of it. He was not, as some of the romantically inclined oral tradition wanted to claim, a man who robbed from the rich to give to the poor. The poor of the Mogiana coffee country were not beneficiaries of his violence. They were its most vulnerable targets when the contracts came from landowners who wanted their workers frightened, their tenants removed, their labor disputes resolved without the inconvenience of negotiation. The myth of the Robin Hood Caipira. The rural Robin Hood, stealing from the wealthy and redistributing to the suffering, was a posthumous fiction, a story told about him rather than by or about the reality of him, a way of making digestible the uncomfortable truth that a man who killed 50 people over 3 years was not a hero but was made possible by a system that had its own uses for exactly what he was. By 1896, the fear in the countryside had become something ambient, something woven into the air of the region. Children grew up knowing his name before they knew many other names. Farmers who had witnessed or heard about his work kept their mouths shut not out of loyalty but out of terror, because informing on Diaguinho was one of the fastest ways to find yourself in need of a surveyor to measure your own burial plot. The silence around him was not the silence of admiration. It was the silence of people who had made a rational calculation about survival and decided that the best position relative to Diaguinho was no position at all, no knowledge, no memory, no willingness to answer any question that any official might someday come to ask. The railway stations of the Mogiana line saw several of his killings. They were places where men passed through, where strangers arrived and departed, where Diaguinho could appear and be gone before anyone organized a coherent response. He used the railway geography, which he knew intimately from his years working alongside the engineers who built those lines, as a kind of operational map. He knew which stations were isolated. He knew which stretches of track ran through areas where a shot would echo without witness. He knew the schedules, the gaps between trains, the hours when platforms emptied and the silence returned. He killed in the afternoon, when the heat made men slow and inattentive. He killed in the evening, when the light was going and faces blurred at distance. He killed at celebrations and dances, where the noise covered the sudden sounds and the chaos covered his exit. He was, in the most clinical sense, a tactician of killing, applying to murder the same spatial intelligence that had once allowed him to divide land into legally defensible parcels and draw precise lines between what belonged to whom. And through all of this, he remained sheltered, remained fed, remained unfound by any authority with the power to end what he was doing. Until 1897, when everything changed, and someone in the government of Sao Paulo finally decided that enough bodies had been counted, enough farmers had been terrorized, enough powerful men had been quietly named in enough whispered testimonies, that the situation could no longer be managed through inattention and official embarrassment. Someone decided it was time to hunt Diaguinho properly, and they chose the man to do it. In April of 1897, the government of the state of Sao Paulo assembled something that had not previously been brought to bear on the problem of Diogo Figueira da Rocha, a dedicated, coordinated, sufficiently resourced task force whose singular purpose was the capture or killing of one man. The officer chosen to lead this operation was a police delegate named Dr. Antonio de Godoy Moreira y Costa, then holding the position of the 4th police delegate of the capital, a man of legal training and administrative experience who was sufficiently respected within the Sao Paulo justice apparatus to be trusted with what was, by 1897, a task that had acquired both political urgency and significant embarrassment potential. The Diaguinho problem, by this point, was not simply a law enforcement failure. It was a public record of institutional weakness that had been building for years. A man with 50 murders and a known operational territory and a network of wealthy patrons who had never been brought to face a court or a cell or any consequence at all. The newspapers of Sao Paulo had been covering the story. The name Diaguinho appeared in print with a regularity that made the Republic's new government uncomfortable. Here was Brazil, attempting to present itself as a modern, functioning nation-state, and here in one of its most productive agricultural. He began not with a dramatic pursuit through the wilderness, but with something more tedious and more effective, intelligence work. He spoke to people. He gathered information. He sifted through the years of whispered testimony that had never been formally collected, finding in the accumulated silences and half-admissions of terrified farmers and railway workers a usable picture of where Diaguinho moved, who fed him, who housed him, and where he was likely to be at any given time. What emerged from this intelligence gathering was a geography. Diaguinho was embedded in the western reaches of the Mogiana region, sheltered on farms in the vicinity of Sao Simeo and the surrounding areas, with the Magi Guatsu River, which the locals called the Mojiguacu, as a kind of operational backbone. He used the river. He moved along it. He knew its crossings, its depths, its seasonal variations. He used canoes. He used the river's banks as pathways between the farms that sheltered him. He knew every bend of that river the way he had once known the lines on his surveying maps. Dr. Antonio de Godoy set up his operation with patient care. He dispatched informants into the region, people who could move through the area without attracting the notice that uniformed police inevitably attracted. He built a picture of the schedules and routes that Diaguinho and his remaining associates used. He identified a man named Joazinho as one of Diaguinho's current companions and closest associates, a man whose movements, if monitored carefully, would eventually lead the authorities directly to his more dangerous companion. The weeks that followed were tense in the specific way that hunts are tense when the quarry doesn't know the net is being drawn and the hunters don't know precisely when the critical moment will come. Dr. Antonio de Godoy's patrol moved through the region in the last days of April 1897, positioning itself, waiting, gathering final confirmation of where the two men would be and when. The date was set, or rather, the date emerged from the intelligence. The 1st of May, 1897. Evening. A location on the banks of the Mojiguacu River near the district of Santa Eudoxia in the São Carlos area. The patrol took up position on the opposite bank. They concealed themselves in the scrub and the fading light. They waited. What they waited for was a canoe. Diaguinho and Joaquinho were coming by water. This was consistent with everything Dr. Antonio de Godoy had learned about how Diaguinho moved. Not on the roads where he might be seen and recognized and reported, but on the river, which gave him speed, which gave him silence, which gave him the option to disappear in multiple directions if something went wrong. He had used this route before. He trusted it. He came by water, as he had come before, with his companion at the oars and his dog. Always the dog, the bird-hunting dog that had trotted beside him through every town and farm and clearing of the last several years, beside him in the boat. The canoe came around a bend in the river. The two men were visible in the dusk light, Joaquinho rowing, Diaguinho presumably watching the bank with the alert, calculating attention of a man who had survived this long precisely because his vigilance never fully relaxed. But the patrol was well hidden. The opposite bank was quiet. The scrub was thick and still. There was no betraying movement, no reflected light off a rifle barrel, no cough or misplaced footstep. The canoe did not come fully to the bank. Something, the particular quality of the silence, a shadow that moved where shadows should not, some faint wrongness in the texture of the evening, gave Diaguinho a fraction of hesitation. Not enough to turn the canoe around, not enough to change what came next, but enough that he had not stepped onto the bank when the patrol opened fire. The shots came from the concealed position on the opposite bank, loud and sudden in the evening stillness. Joaquinho was hit. He went over the side of the canoe and into the river, and the river took him, and that was the last anyone saw of him alive. His body was found the following morning on the São Simão side of the river and was buried there, quietly and quickly, as bodies in that region tended to be. Diaguinho was also hit, or so the accounts suggest, based on the later testimonies of those who claimed to have been present and on the physical evidence of a struggle in the water. He went over the side of the canoe. The dog went with him, and the river, wide and dark and moving with the particular indifference of water toward all human drama, closed over both of them. The patrol searched. They moved along the bank. They sent men into the water. They looked for a body, for blood on the surface, for any sign of what the river had taken. They found nothing. The darkness deepened. The search continued into the night and into the following morning. And still nothing. No body. No blood trail leading to a bank somewhere downstream. No dog found drowned in the reeds. No Diaguinho. Dr. Antonio de Godoy reported the operation concluded. The criminal presumed dead. The official record registered Diogo Figueira de Rocha as deceased, killed in a shootout with police on the 1st of May, 1897, on the banks of the Mojaguaca River, at the age of 33. Case closed. File sealed. Threat eliminated. Except that the body was never found. And in the coffee country, among the farmers and the railway workers and the women who had been bolting their shutters at dusk for 3 years, the absence of a body was not nothing. A body was proof. A body was certainty. A body was a grave you could visit, a stone you could read, a fact laid permanently in the earth that could not unsay itself. What the river had given back was not a body but a silence, and in the interior of São Paulo in 1897, silence was not the same thing as proof. The rumors began almost immediately. Someone had seen him, someone's cousin, on a farm outside Botucatu, had spoken to a paralyzed man in a back room who had the eyes of a person who had seen too much and done worse. Someone had passed a farmhouse at night and heard a dog bark that sounded like the dog. The bird dog, the constant companion, the one the newspapers had mentioned in their descriptions of Diaguinho's habits. Someone had heard a voice. Someone had seen a shadow that moved with a familiar wariness at the edge of a property. None of these sightings produced a verifiable body, a confirmed arrest, a definitive ending. The man had been declared dead. His accomplices were being rounded up and prosecuted. Or, more precisely, being arrested and then mostly released, because the São Paulo Court of Justice found itself caught in the legal paradox that complicity charges require proof of the primary crime, and the primary crime could not be fully prosecuted against a dead man whose death itself was not fully proven. Several fazenderos who had harbored Diaguinho for years walked free. The uncomfortable network of complicity that had made his career possible was never properly dismantled, because the ending of the story was too ambiguous to support the clean architecture of legal consequence. But the question that the absence of a body kept alive long after the official file was closed, is the one that gives this case its particular, enduring unease. Was Diaguinho dead? Had the Mojiguacu River swallowed him completely and given nothing back, as rivers in that region sometimes did? Or had the man who had spent 3 years learning to disappear into the landscape simply done it one last time, more completely than ever before, dropping beneath the surface of official knowledge and continuing to exist somewhere in the vastness of the Brazilian interior, paralyzed perhaps, hidden certainly, alive? Some accounts say he was dragged from the river by loyalists, brought to a farm outside Botucatu, kept in a back room, paralyzed from his wounds, sustained by the same network of silence and loyalty that had sheltered him through 3 years of killing. That he lived for another 3 years in that hidden room, his body broken but his mind intact, and that he died in 1900 with the secret of his continued existence kept by those who had always kept his secrets. Other accounts say he recovered fully and was seen in various parts of Brazil for years afterward, that he changed his name and moved north, that he died peacefully in Minas Gerais sometime in the early 20th century, an old man in a country that no longer remembered his face. Dr. Antonio de Godoy, who had commanded the operation and written about it afterward in his 1903 book, Diaguinho, Narrativa de Complice M. Dialecto, maintained the official position. Diaguinho was dead. The operation had succeeded. The state of Sao Paulo had been freed of its most persistent and prolific killer. The case was over. But Dr. Antonio de Godoy never found the body either. What happens to a story when the body is missing? What happens to the accounting, the closure, the formal architecture of ending, when the thing that should anchor the conclusion to reality simply isn't there? This is not merely a philosophical question in the case of Diaguinho. It is the central structural feature of what he left behind, the way that the absence of a corpse became, over the decades that followed, a living wound in the collective memory of the Sao Paulo interior, a wound that kept generating stories, kept producing sightings and myths and literary treatments and cinematic retellings, because a story without an ending demands that people keep writing endings for it. The mythology took hold quickly. Within years of the 1897 shootout, Diaguinho had begun his transformation from documented killer into something else, a figure of the popular imagination, a legend of the interior, the Bandido Caipira whose name was still being spoken around fires and in back rooms decades after his supposed death. The oral tradition attached itself to him with a fierceness that surprised observers, because the things being attached were not entirely the things he actually was. The Robin Hood narrative came first, the claim that he had robbed from the wealthy coffee barons and redistributed to the poor, that he had been a protector of the powerless, that his violence had been directed upward at the powerful rather than outward at anyone who happened to trigger his particular calculus of personal affront. This was false. It was comprehensively, documentably false. The people who had actually known him, who had written about him, who had been present for portions of his career, said clearly and consistently that the man helped the poor only by accident and only occasionally, and that the primary beneficiaries of his work had been wealthy landowners who paid for his services and powerful men who found his presence useful. But popular myth is not interested in accurate accounting. Popular myth is interested in narrative form, in the shape of a story that can be carried and retold, and the shape that attached itself to Diaguinho, the wronged man, the outcast, the instrument of rough justice against the powerful, was a shape that the rural poor of Sao Paulo had always needed someone to wear. He became their legend not because he was their protector, but because they needed a protector, and he was the most vivid, most ferocious, most permanently uncontainable figure available to fill that shape. In 1903, Dr. Antonio de Godoy published his account of the hunt and capture, or rather, the hunt and presumed death, since capture never actually occurred. The book was written from the perspective of a fictional accomplice, a narrative device that allowed him to present the story with literary texture and dramatic immediacy, while working from the real documented evidence of his own investigation. It was the first substantial written account of Diaguinho's career and became the primary source for subsequent retellings. It was a serious, relatively careful piece of work by a man who had personal knowledge of the events described, and it established many of the factual contours that all later treatments drew from. In 1949, Another police delegate named João Amoroso Neto published a series of articles about Diaguinho in the Diário de Noite newspaper, supplementing Dr. Antonio de Godoy's account with material drawn from archived judicial proceedings in the courts of Botucatu, Ribeirão Preto, and São Simão. These judicial archives revealed, in their dry legal language, the extraordinary scope of the network that had supported and sheltered Diaguinho, the fazendeiros named as accomplices, the habeas corpus proceedings that freed them, the court's reasoning about why the complicity charges could not stand without a properly prosecuted primary criminal. They also revealed something about the economic logic of his career that the purely narrative accounts tended to underemphasize. That he had been, in a very real sense, a service provider to the violent economy of coffee country land consolidation, and that the men who had paid him had gotten what they paid for and had largely escaped any consequence for it. He was eventually immortalized in film. A movie called Diaguinho was produced in 1916 or 1917, just 2 decades after his death, by the Paulista Filme Company, directed by Guelfo Andalo, with the participation of actual residents of the Santa Eudoxia area where the final confrontation had taken place. That anyone alive in 1917 had personal memory of events from 1897 meant that the film was produced within living memory, which gives it a particular kind of documentary weight. A later film retelling followed decades afterward. Radio Record in Sao Paulo broadcast a serialist drama about him, O Diaguinho, that aired weekly and drew enormous audiences, cementing the mythologized version of his story into the popular imagination with the peculiar permanence of repeated broadcast. The fictional Diaguinho, the Robin Hood Caipira, the protector of the poor, the romantic outcast driven to violence by an unjust system and an aristocratic patriarch's cruelty, became, over the course of the 20th century, the version that most people knew. The real Diaguinho, the surveyor turned contract killer, the man who murdered people for money and for crushed hats and for insults at dances, the man whose career was enabled by a network of wealthy complicity that the legal system ultimately declined to dismantle, was harder to locate. He existed in the archives of the Sao Paulo court system. He existed in the police records of the comarcas of Botucatu and Ribeirão Preto and São Simão. He existed in the careful, methodical writing of Dr. Antonio de Godoy and in the subsequent academic analysis of historians who took his case seriously enough to examine it against the actual documentary record rather than the romantic overlay. He also existed in the absence of a body. That absence generated stories that were still being told a century later. The paralytic in the back room of the Botucatu farm, real or invented, no one could prove either way. The sightings in Minas Gerais, in Bahia, in locations increasingly distant from the Mojiguaca River. The family members of people who claimed to have seen him years after 1897, producing accounts with the kind of specific detail that false memory tends to generate when the memory is shaped by strong emotion. The way he walked, the way he held his arm, the way he looked at a person with a measuring quality, as if calculating the distance between them. Academic historians who examined the Diaguinho case in later decades were generally careful to observe that the documentary evidence strongly supported death at the river in 1897. The combination of the police operations scale, the wounds he is believed to have sustained, the terrain, and the absence of any subsequent documented criminal activity attributable to him all pointed toward a man who had died in that river and been carried away by the current. The absence of a body was not evidence of survival. It was evidence of the Mojiguaca River's habit of keeping what it took, of the darkness of the water and the density of the undergrowth, and the fact that a body entering a Brazilian river in 1897 was not a body that any forensic protocol was going to locate, document, and identify. But the stories persisted. Precisely because they could not be conclusively disproven, they lived. What does Diaguinho's career tell us, at a distance of more than a century, about the world that produced and sustained it? It tells us something uncomfortable about the relationship between institutional violence and criminal violence, about the ways in which a state that is not fully a state, a legal system that is not fully functional, an economy that runs on coercion and land consolidation, will always find uses for men like Diaguinho, will always produce them and shelter them and mourn their absence when they are gone. The fazendeiros who paid him and housed him were not aberrations in the Brazilian coffee economy of the 1890s. They were features of it. The system that allowed Diaguinho to kill 50 people over 3 years without meaningful consequence was not a failed system. It was a working one, working exactly as the people with power in it had designed it to work, producing the outcomes that the people with power in it wanted produced. The 50 victims, more than 50 by most estimates, with the official count limited by what was actually documented and reported, were not abstract numbers. They were people. They had names, families, reasons for being on the road or at the railway station or at the dance where they encountered something that ended them. They were men whose disputes with their employers or their neighbors or their land boundaries had been resolved against them through a mechanism they had no access to and no defense against. They were men whose only crime was to have sat on a hat. They were men whose deaths served someone else's commercial interest and whose killers ate dinner calmly afterward. Diaguinho was not a monster in the sense of being something other than human. That is perhaps the most disturbing conclusion that his case delivers. He was a human being who had made a series of choices, or who had had a series of choices made for him by a world that offered him specific options and withheld others, and who had arrived, through those choices and those violences done to him, at a place where killing had no more moral weight than surveying. He brought the same precision to both. He brought the same detachment. He walked away from both with the same unhurried step. He was 33 years old on the evening of the 1st of May, 1897, when the shots came from the bank of the Mojiguacu River and the dark water rose around him. If he died that night, and the most rigorous reading of the available evidence suggests that he did, then his career spanned the years of Brazil's first republic, the years of the coffee boom, the years when the country was trying to construct a modern national identity over the still warm foundations of a slave economy and a monarchical one. He was a product of that construction project's failures, of the gaps between what the republic claimed to be and what it actually was in the red-soiled reality of its interior. If he survived, if the backroom stories are true, if the paralytic on the Bachacata farm was him, if the voice heard near the river in 1900 or 1902 was his, then he lived out his remaining years in a silence imposed not by choice but by circumstance, broken and hidden, kept alive by the same loyalty that had kept him alive through 3 years of the most active killing the state of São Paulo had recorded in a single individual. And then he died quietly, in a room somewhere, without a record and without a body for anyone to produce as proof of anything. Either way, the river kept the secret. The Mojiguacu River still runs through that part of São Paulo. The coffee country is still there, transformed by a century of mechanization and globalization into something unrecognizable compared to the world Diaguinho moved through, but still red-soiled, still sun-heavy, still marked by the particular quality of light in the late afternoon that makes the long landscape glow briefly before the darkness comes. The railway lines that once threaded through the Mogiana region still exist, though they carry different things now and are no longer navigated by the same desperate, calculating intelligence that once used their stations and their silent stretches as operational geography. And in the archives of the São Paulo Court of Justice, in the comarcas of Bachacatu and Ribeirão Preto and São Simão, the dusty judicial records of habeas corpus proceedings and accomplice investigations and police reports still preserve the faint documentary outline of what he actually was. Not the Robin Hood of the later legend, not the romantic outcast of the radio drama and the cinema, but the thing the records described him as in their careful, bureaucratic language. A career criminal responsible for more than 50 deaths, operating within the state of São Paulo between 1894 and 1897, presumed dead as of the 1st of May of that year in a shootout with police. Presumed. Not confirmed. Not proven. Presumed. The dog was never found either. And somewhere along the dark banks of the Mojiguacu, in the hour between the last light and the full dark, on evenings when the river runs high and the scrub is heavy with the particular silence that falls after gunshots stop echoing, on evenings like that, you can almost understand why the people of the coffee country kept his story alive for so long, kept it breathing and unfinalized, kept refusing to accept the bureaucratic certainty that the official record offered. Because a story without a body is a story without a door to close. And Diaguinho, the little devil of the interior, the surveyor who measured land for a living and then measured the distance between himself and everyone he killed, never gave them a door, just a river, just a darkness, just the silence of the Mojiguacu keeping, as rivers keep, everything that falls into them and nothing that was ever asked of them afterward. The case of Diogo Figueira de Rocha, Diaguinho, remains one of the most documented and most unresolved criminal stories in the history of the Brazilian interior. More than 50 confirmed deaths, 3 years of unchecked killing, a government task force, a final confrontation at a river, and then nothing. No body, no grave, no ending that anyone could hold in their hands and say, "Here, this is where it stopped." He was born in Botucatu on the 9th of October, 1863. He was last seen entering the waters of the Mojiguaca River on the evening of the 1st of May, 1897. What the river did with him after that, only the river knows. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Phantom of Goiânia. He wore a uniform that was supposed to protect people. Then he went home, loaded his gun, and chose his next number. AKA, O Matador de Goiás, the harvester of the forgotten. He didn't stalk. He didn't plan for weeks. He simply woke up, felt the weight pressing behind his eyes like a furnace with no exhaust, and rode. Somewhere between the year 2011 and the autumn of 2014, the city of Goiânia, Brazil, was being quietly drained of its most vulnerable souls. Not in a single catastrophic event that the world could point to, not in a war or a disaster that newspapers could frame with a headline and a body count, but one by one, in the dark, on empty streets, with the quiet mechanical growl of a motorcycle engine that nobody ever thought twice about until it was already too late. The murders were not dramatic in the theatrical sense. There was no elaborate ritual, no calling card left at the scene, no pattern cryptic enough to fill a detective's corkboard with red string and question marks. What made this killer so terrifying, so genuinely, viscerally suffocating in his horror, was the utter blankness of it all. A man would pull up beside a stranger, shout a single word, and pull a trigger. No rage in his face, no trembling hands, no second thoughts. Just a number ticking upward in the ledger he kept inside his skull, cool and clinical, the way an accountant records a transaction. By the time the last shell casing had cooled on the concrete, that ledger had reached 39. 39 human beings. Women walking home from work, teenagers on street corners, homeless men sleeping beneath bridges, couples sitting in parked cars. Reduced to digits by a man who clocked in every morning wearing a security guard's uniform, smiled at his colleagues, went home to his mother's house, and apparently felt nothing. His name was Tiago Henrique Gomes de Rocha, and this every suffocating, blood-soaked, bewildering chapter of it is his story. Goiânia is not a city that appears on most international maps of infamy. It sits in the heart of Brazil's sprawling interior, the capital of the state of Goiás, a place of wide boulevards, sweltering heat, and the particular kind of social geography that defines many rapidly expanding South American cities. Gleaming apartment towers casting long shadows over crumbling neighborhoods where the forgotten congregate after dark. It is a city of contrasts, of aspiration and neglect existing in perpetual adjacency, where the wealthy jog through landscaped parks in the morning and the homeless claim their corners by nightfall, and where the great indifferent machinery of ordinary life rolls forward with the assumption that nothing truly terrible is quietly gestating within it. By 2011, Tiago Henrique Gomes de Rocha was 23 years old. He was, by every outward measure, unremarkable. He had grown up in the city, the product of a working-class household, and had secured employment as a security guard, the kind of mid-level, uniformed position that carries an implicit social contract, a suggestion of trustworthiness, a man paid to stand between danger and the people who needed protecting. He was not, in the recollections of those who knew him casually, a man who raised alarm. He had a girlfriend. He attended church. He smiled when smiled at. He blended, effortlessly and completely, into the vast, unremarkable backdrop of city life. But something had been rotting inside Tiago Gomez de Rocha for a very long time. Something that, according to his own later account, offered to investigators with a flatness that disturbed even seasoned detectives, had its roots in childhood trauma. At the age of 11, he claimed he had been sexually abused by a neighbor. Whether investigators could fully verify this claim or not, what mattered was what it had apparently seeded inside him. A festering, misdirected fury that grew with every passing year, not outward in obvious antisocial behavior, not in outbursts or arrests or warning signs that a community might register, but inward, compacted and pressurized, waiting for the first fracture. When the fracture came, it did not announce itself with catastrophe. It arrived, according to everything that would later emerge, as a kind of relief. A quiet unburdening. A terrible release that only created a more terrible hunger. The first killing attributed to Gomez de Rocha occurred in 2011. The method was already fully formed, as though it had been rehearsed in his mind for years before it was ever executed in the physical world. He rode a motorcycle, a vehicle that offered the twin advantages of speed and anonymity, a machine that could materialize beside a pedestrian and vanish around a corner before anyone had time to register what had just happened. He wore a helmet which concealed his face. He carried a .38 caliber revolver, a weapon common enough in Brazil's informal firearms landscape that it would not immediately distinguish itself in a city already weighed down by gun violence statistics. He would approach a victim, usually on foot, usually alone, usually at night, usually on a quiet residential street or a poorly lit stretch of road, and before the stranger had time to fully register the presence of the motorcycle, he would shout a single word: "Assalto," robbery. But he never took anything. Not once. Not a wallet, not a phone, not a piece of jewelry. The word was not a precursor to theft. It was a mechanism, a verbal trigger designed to freeze the target in the crucial half-second between confusion and reaction, to ensure the victim's eyes were still processing the situation. Still computing, still deciding, still alive in the ordinary sense of living when the bullet arrived. He shot his victims at close range. The homeless men he typically struck in the head or torso. The women. And this detail would become one of the most deeply disturbing elements of his pattern when it later emerged. He shot in the chest. Deliberately, preferentially, as if the act carried a specific meaning for him that went beyond the mechanics of killing, as if the placement was a signature, a statement, an expression of the particular contempt or anguish or twisted desire that animated the worst of what he did. In the early killings, Goiânia's authorities did not connect the dots. This was not, in retrospect, entirely surprising. The city had a significant rate of violent crime, the kind endemic to Brazilian urban centers navigating the overlapping crises of poverty, drug trafficking, and inequality. A homeless person shot in the street was a tragedy, but it was not immediately a mystery. Such deaths were, horrifically, not anomalous. A woman shot in a neighborhood after dark registered as a robbery gone wrong, or gang-adjacent violence, or the kind of crime whose perpetrator would remain forever uncaught in an overburdened justice system. The killings were geographically distributed across the city, which further obscured the pattern. Gomez de Rocha was not operating in a single district, not hunting the same stretch of road night after night. He was mobile, ranging across the city the way a predator ranges across territory, and the randomness of geography made it harder for investigators to see the thread connecting one death to the next. The thread was him, and he was invisible. He went to work in his uniform. He sat with his girlfriend. He ate meals with his mother in the house they shared. He lived, by all appearances, the life of an ordinary young Brazilian man. Perhaps a little quiet, perhaps a little contained, but not dangerously so, not noticeably so. And when the pressure built, when whatever mechanism inside him that drove the killing demanded its release, he took the motorcycle out. The victims in those early years were overwhelmingly from Goiânia's most marginalized populations. Homeless individuals, people living rough under bridges and in parks, occupied a significant portion of the early body count. Gay men, often sex workers, were targeted with what would later appear to be deliberate selection. Gomez de Rocha, in his eventual confessions, described a particular hatred for homosexuals, a contempt rooted in whatever warped moral architecture he had constructed inside himself, a framework in which certain categories of human being were not merely devalued but actively deserving of obliteration. Drug users, prostitutes, people whose society had already edged toward the periphery of visibility, whose disappearances or violent deaths might not immediately generate the kind of community alarm and investigative urgency that would follow the murder of someone with a stable address and a family loudly demanding answers. There is a phrase that criminologists use when discussing how serial killers sustain their activity over extended periods: victim selection as camouflage. It describes the way some killers, consciously or not, choose victims whose deaths are less likely to generate coordinated investigative pressure. Not because those lives matter less in any moral sense, but because the institutional machinery of law enforcement and media attention responds differently to different kinds of missing or murdered people. Gomez de Rocha, whatever the depth of his conscious reasoning, had landed upon an approach that functioned as precisely this kind of camouflage. His earliest victims were people whose deaths, while recorded and mourned by those who knew them, did not immediately accumulate into a visible emergency. But he was not static. The nature of what he was doing, the frequency, the geography, the victim profile was not fixed. It was evolving, expanding, spreading outward from the margins and into the broader population of the city. By 2012, the killings were continuing. By 2013, they had not slowed. And by 2014, in the final year before his capture, something had shifted in both the pace and the nature of the targets. He was killing more. He was killing differently. The young women had always been part of his pattern, but in 2014, they became more prominent. He was selecting them from streets, from neighborhoods that were not exclusively poor or marginalized, shooting them in the chest, always in the chest, and riding away before the echo had fully dissolved. A 14-year-old girl. A 22-year-old woman and her boyfriend, seated in a parked car in the Cedar Oeste district in July 2014, their evening ending in the sudden mechanical violence of Gomez de Rocha's revolver before anyone on that street had processed the sound of the engine pulling up alongside them. The woman, Juliana Nubia Diaz, would become one of the specific cases on which he was eventually convicted, a name attached to the otherwise anonymous numbers he had assigned his victims in his own accounting. 39. That was the number he would eventually surrender to investigators, the total he attached to the confession that shocked even hardened law enforcement officials. 39 people across 3 years, killed not in moments of calculated premeditation or elaborate planning, but in the almost casual execution of an urge. A pressure release mechanism that had become, for Tiago Gomez de Rocha, as routine as any other regular, recurring human behavior. What the city of Goiânia did not yet know, as 2014 progressed and the bodies continued to accumulate, was that the man who had been doing this was not hiding in any dramatic or elaborate way. He was hiding in the most effective possible place. In plain sight, in a uniform, behind a face that no one thought to look at twice. The reckoning was coming. But first, it would have to arrive through the most mundane of mechanisms, not through brilliant detective work or a witness's tearful confession, but through a stolen license plate, a motorbike in a supermarket parking lot, and the slow turning of bureaucratic wheels that would eventually grind close enough to the truth that Tiago Gomez de Rocha's carefully maintained invisibility would simply collapse. He did not know yet that the city was beginning to see him. He was still riding. There are people who, upon learning of a serial killer's capture, describe the experience of retrospective dread, the sensation of reordering everything you thought you understood about safety and the legibility of danger once you know that the thing you feared was never where you were looking for it. For the residents of Goiânia who would later learn the details of what Tiago Gomez de Rocha had been doing in their city for 3 years, that retrospective dread had a particular texture, because the man was not a ghost. He was not a stranger who had drifted into the city from elsewhere. He was local. He was employed. He had, in the most ordinary sense imaginable, been among them. He had, it emerged in later reporting, a girlfriend, a young woman described as pretty, church-going, with long dark hair. The detail was noted by Brazilian journalists because of its unsettling specificity. Several of his female victims had also had long dark hair. Whether this was a pattern of conscious selection or a coincidence that the mind reaches for in its attempt to make coherent what resists coherence, investigators could not say with certainty. What they could say was that the man who returned home to that relationship, who presumably sat at dinner tables and held ordinary conversations and performed the social rituals of romantic partnership, was the same man who had shot 16 women at close range, one of them only 14 years old. The psychological examination of Gomez de Rocha, conducted after his arrest, produced a finding that would surprise no one who had studied the forensic literature on individuals capable of sustained violence of this kind. He exhibited psychopathic personality traits. But the evaluation was specific on a crucial point. He was not, in the clinical and legal sense, detached from reality or incapable of understanding what he was doing. He knew. He had always known. The killings were not the product of delusion or psychosis, not the expression of a mind that had broken its moorings with the shared world. They were deliberate, purposeful, and accompanied at every stage by a clear understanding that what he was doing was, by every legal and moral standard available to him, wrong. He killed because he wanted to, because it released something, because the weight behind his eyes, the pressure, the compacted fury, the thing that had been growing since childhood, subsided in the aftermath of each killing with a completeness that nothing else in his life could match. He had not stumbled into murder. He had found his way to it the way a person finds the thing that fills their particular emptiness, and he had returned to it, again and again, for 3 years with the quiet consistency of someone who has discovered a habit. The specific mechanics of a Gomez de Rocha killing, reconstructed from his confessions and the physical evidence gathered by investigators, are worth dwelling on, not for the sake of spectacle, but because understanding the method is essential to understanding the particular kind of terror that he visited upon the city. There was nothing ornate about it. The horror was in its efficiency, its ordinariness, the devastating gap between the complexity of the lives he extinguished and the simplicity of the mechanism by which he extinguished them. He would select the neighborhood or the stretch of road. This was not elaborate reconnaissance. He was familiar with the city in the way any long-term resident is, instinctively attuned to which streets emptied out after 10, which parks drew the homeless, which corners the sex workers occupied, which residential avenues offered the combination of isolation and pedestrian traffic that his method required. He would ride until he saw someone alone, someone who fit whatever internal criteria were operating in him on that particular night. Someone he had already, without their knowledge and without any possibility of appeal, assigned a number. He would approach. The motorcycle engine, which should have been a warning, which in retrospect becomes, in every reconstruction of these events, the sound of death arriving, registered to the victim simply as city noise, as the background acoustic texture of an ordinary evening. Then, close enough that the shot would not miss, he would call out, "Asalto." And in the moment that the word created the fractional pause of confusion and assessment, the window between hearing and understanding, he fired. For the homeless victims, the shot typically went to the head or upper body. They were often seated, sleeping, hunched against walls, already occupying the posture of people the city had rendered invisible. For the women, especially the young women, the ones with the long dark hair, the ones who had been walking home or sitting in cars or standing on corners, the shot went to the chest. Always the chest. A police official who reviewed the case files would later describe the consistency of this pattern as one of the details most difficult to process about Gomez de Rocha, because it implied not merely a capacity for violence but a specific, intimate intention within the violence. A targeting that suggested something beyond the desire to kill efficiently. He never lingered. The motorcycle was already moving before the body hit the ground. He was around the corner, down the street, absorbed back into the city's ordinary traffic within seconds. No witnesses in a position to provide a useful description. No physical evidence left at the scene beyond the bullet and the casing. Just the sudden, irrevocable absence of someone who, moments earlier, had been alive and completely unaware that their life was about to become a number in a private ledger. In 2014, the killing rate accelerated. What had been, in the earlier years, a pace that investigators later estimated at roughly 1 victim every few weeks became more frequent. Something had shifted in the internal calculus that governed Gomez de Rocha's activity. The intervals between killings were compressing, the hunger demanding more regular feeding. The population of victims was also broadening. A couple shot in their parked car. A young woman on a residential street in broad enough evening light that her neighbors would later describe hearing something but not registering its significance. The killings were no longer operating exclusively in the shadows of the city's most marginalized geography. They were reaching into neighborhoods where the residents had a stronger social voice, where deaths generated more insistent questions, where the absence of a known perpetrator began to accumulate into something that the city's authorities could not continue to absorb without consequence. It was in this period that Goiânia's police began to compile the pattern seriously. The weapon, a .38 revolver used consistently across the killings, was a connecting thread. The motorcycle, always a motorcycle, described by those who had seen it without seeing its rider clearly enough to help. The false robbery pretext that never yielded any robbery. The geographic spread. The victim categories, homeless, female, gay men, recurring across unconnected crime scenes with a frequency that moved beyond coincidence into something investigators were forced to name. A serial killer was operating in Goiânia. The city was finally saying it out loud. The investigation that intensified in the final months of 2014 was, by the reckoning of the detectives working it, an exercise in pursuing a shadow. Gomes de Rocha had left almost nothing forensically traceable at his scenes. He had no prior violent criminal history to flag him. He had no social footprint that suggested murderous instability, no prior arrests for assault, no restraining orders, no history of documented aggression that might have placed his name on a list. He was, in every investigative sense, clean. What he had, and what would ultimately undo him, was a weakness for motorcycles and a carelessness about plates. In January 2014, months before his arrest, in the same month he killed his youngest known victim, Gomes de Rocha had been caught on camera stealing a license plate from a motorcycle in a supermarket parking lot in Goiânia. The theft was recorded, an incident report was filed, and in the slow machinery of Brazilian judicial processing, a trial date was scheduled. It was a minor offense, the kind that accumulates in judicial backlogs without urgency. Nobody connected it, at that stage, to the series of killings spreading across the city. But the case created a file, and the file contained a name. And when investigators working the serial killer investigation expanded their parameters, casting wider nets through the city's existing criminal records for individuals connected to motorcycles, to plate fraud, to vehicle-related offenses that might suggest a person who relied on motorcycles for activities they needed to conceal, the file from the supermarket parking lot surfaced. Tiago Enrique Gomes de Rocha, security guard, motorcycle rider. The address was his mother's house. On October 14, 2014, police stopped him on the street. He was riding a motorcycle. He was riding on false plates, not even the same set he had stolen from the supermarket, but a different set suggesting a habit, a recurring need to obscure the vehicle that had been present at more crime scenes than any database yet officially connected. He was detained, and then, in the interrogation room, something happened that investigators had not fully anticipated. He began to talk. There are confessions that arrive with weeping, with visible anguish, with the physical and emotional convulsions of a person who has been carrying something unspeakable and now, in the confessional rupture of interrogation, releases it with all the raw, messy humanity of genuine remorse. There are confessions that come with anger, with defiance, with the kind of performative bravado that some killers use to manage the psychological crisis of exposure. And then there are confessions like Tiago Gomes de Rocha's, which arrived with neither of those things. What arrived instead was something that would disturb the investigators who witnessed it far more than either tears or defiance, because it was, above all else, calm. He was not frightened. He was not relieved, at least not in any way that manifested visibly. He was not defiant. He sat in the interrogation room and he answered questions in the measured, informational tone of a man recounting a history he had long since processed internally and had no particular emotional charge remaining around. He spoke about the killings the way one might speak about a series of recurring errands, not without engagement, but without the weight that should accompany what he was describing. The weight that, sitting across the table from him, every person present felt acutely in the space between his words. What broke through the professional composure of the police official overseeing the interrogation, a man who, by the nature of his career, had sat across from violent criminals before, was the numbers. Not the number 39, though that figure was staggering enough. It was the way Gomez de Rocha referred to his victims by number. First victim, second victim. Numbers 1 through 39, recited in sequence, cataloged the way one catalogs items in a collection, each entry devoid of the biographical detail that would restore its humanity. The investigators found themselves, in that room, confronting something that the academic literature on psychopathy describes clinically but that no clinical description adequately prepares you for. A human being who had spent 3 years ending other human beings' lives and had organized the experience into an internal numerical archive, free of names, free of faces, free of any of the emotional texture that the word murder carries for those of us who exist on the other side of that dividing line. He recounted, in the course of the confession that extended over hours, the selection of victims. He described, with the same flat informativeness, the motorcycle approach, the shouted pretext, the firing. He described the differentiation in targeting, the homeless, the gay men, the women. He described the chest shots directed at the women with a specificity that investigators found deeply troubling, not just for what it implied about his psychology, but for what it revealed about the degree of conscious agency in each killing. These were not panicked, impulsive acts executed in a state of dissociated blackout. They were deliberate, controlled, selected and executed with a precision that required his full, clear-eyed presence. "We have been shocked by his coldness," a police official told Brazilian television in the immediate aftermath of the interrogation. It was a remark that captured something real. Not the cold of an emotionally absent automaton, but the specific cold of a man who had made his peace, entirely and privately, with what he had done, and who now sat across from people whose world had been upended by the revelation of it, and could offer them no matching turbulence in return. The confession placed 39 victims in Gomez de Rocha's account. 39 lives that had ended on Goiânia's streets between 2011 and 2014. The breakdown, as it emerged through the confession and subsequent investigation, was 16 female victims, including a 14-year-old girl murdered in January 2014, the youngest in the sequence, a fact that sent particular shockwaves through Brazilian media coverage when it became public. Homeless men, targeted across multiple locations across the city. Gay men, specifically targeted, many of them sex workers or individuals who frequented areas Gomez de Rocha had apparently mapped as gathering points for a population he had decided he could erase without consequence. The youth of his female victims was not incidental. Several of them were in their late teens or early 20s. Several had long dark hair. The connection to his girlfriend's appearance that Brazilian newspapers reported as a detail emerging from investigation. A detail that layered the horror of what he had done with a further dimension of disturbing psychological complexity. The women he chose to kill and the woman he chose to love bore a resemblance to each other that investigators and psychologists would later analyze with the vocabulary of trauma, displacement, and the lethal misdirection of whatever had fractured inside him in childhood. He had, in some sense, been circling the same image again and again, and the direction of that circling had two faces: the intimacy of a relationship and the finality of a bullet. The aftermath of the confession was immediate and overwhelming. Brazilian authorities, who had for months been working a serial killer case with frustratingly little traction, found themselves in the sudden, disorienting position of having not merely a suspect but a confession, and a confession of a scale that placed Goiânia on the map of international crime in a way that few Brazilian cities outside São Paulo and Rio had ever occupied. Press conferences were held. Officials congratulated themselves on the arrest, though the arrest itself had been, as noted, accidental in the sense that it had originated in a stolen license plate rather than the investigative work targeting the killing specifically. Gomez de Rocha was paraded before cameras in the way that has become, in Brazilian criminal justice, a fraught tradition, the suspect displayed publicly, surrounded by officials, the exposure functioning as a kind of institutional performance of resolution. He stood before the cameras with the same quality that had disturbed investigators in the interrogation room. Not cowed, not visibly remorseful, sharp-eyed, patchy-bearded, 26 years old and possessed of a stillness that read, to the cameras and to the public consuming the footage at home, as the stillness not of a person who had been caught and broken but of a person who had been caught and remained, somehow, intact. One day after the press conference, alone in his cell, Tiago Gomez de Rocha attempted to take his own life. He had shattered a light bulb and used the fragments to cut his wrists. The attempt was discovered and he was treated. He did not succeed. The legal process began its slow, grinding motion. In the weeks and months that followed the arrest, something began to occur that complicated the already complicated picture. Gomez de Rocha, now represented by defense counsel, began to walk back portions of the confession. He had, his lawyers indicated, confessed to more than he was actually responsible for. The number 39, they argued, was inflated, whether by a desire to confess completely, or by investigative suggestion during interrogation, or by something else in the psychological landscape of a man whose relationship with truth and performance of self was already demonstrably unusual. Brazilian prosecutors and investigators pushed back, maintaining that the physical evidence, the geographical records, the ballistic connections, and the specificity of detail in the original confession supported a victim count in the range of what he had initially described. The divergence between the 39 Gomez de Rocha had initially claimed and the number his defense eventually narrowed to would become one of the enduring legal complications of the case. Brazilian law operates within a jury trial system for cases of intentional murder, and each homicide must be tried individually, meaning that 39 alleged killings translated not into a single monolithic trial but into a series of distinct proceedings, each requiring its own evidentiary presentation, its own jury, its own verdict. The scale of the case made this process extraordinary in its duration and complexity. The first conviction came in March 2016. The victim was Juliana Nubia Diaz, 22 years old, shot in the Cedar Oeste district in July 2014, the evening she and her boyfriend had been sitting in a parked car when the motorcycle pulled up. The jury found Gomez de Rocha guilty of aggravated homicide with 2 aggravated circumstances. The killing had been motivated by a base motive, and it had been executed in a manner that deliberately prevented the victim from defending herself. He was sentenced to 20 years for that case alone. It was the first of many. Justice, in the case of Tiago Enrique Gomez de Rocha, did not arrive in a single courtroom moment. It arrived in installments. Case after case, trial after trial, verdict after verdict, across a span of proceedings that stretched from 2015 through 2018, accumulating sentences the way Gomez de Rocha had accumulated victims, one at a time, until the total reached a number so large it had lost all practical relationship to what a human being can actually serve. 650 years. Some reports placed the cumulative sentence even higher as additional convictions layered atop one another through the multiple jury proceedings. 650 years or more, imposed upon a man who had entered the world in 1988 and would, under any realistic projection of human biology, cease to occupy it within the normal parameters of a human lifespan. The sentence was not meant to be served in its totality. Brazilian law caps the amount of time any individual can actually spend imprisoned. The effective maximum, regardless of the total sentence imposed, is 40 years. This is not a loophole or a leniency. It is a constitutional constraint rooted in the legal philosophy that no punishment can be of perpetual, irreversible character. Tiago Gomez de Rocha would serve his time at the Odnir Guimarães Penitentiary, a maximum security institution in Goiás, for decades. But the arithmetic of his sentence, stacked against the architecture of Brazilian law, meant that the numbers were, in their own way, as theoretical as the 39 he had himself once recited. There was a particular trial, one that drew the most media attention of the entire series of proceedings, in which the jury that convicted Gomez de Rocha deliberated not for days but for hours, the evidence so substantial that the time required for formal verdict was almost compressive in its brevity. Witnesses who had been present at scenes adjacent to murders. Ballistic experts who traced the trajectory of rounds to the recovered weapon, the .38 revolver found at the house he had shared with his mother. The stolen motorcycle, the false plates, stacked in a pattern of repeated concealment. The original confession, or the portions of it that defense counsel had not successfully challenged, entering the courtroom in the voices of the investigators who had sat across from him on the night it was given. He sat through the proceedings with the same quality he had brought to everything, the containment, the absence of visible fracture. People who observed him in court described the experience in terms that returned repeatedly to a single unsettling theme: that he appeared throughout to be watching events that concerned someone else. Not dissociated in the clinical sense, not absent or incomprehending, but removed in the way that a person who has already fully processed and concluded their own internal reckoning with something might observe its external, formal iteration. He had already decided, somewhere in the private chambers of whatever served him as conscience, how he felt about what he had done. The verdict of the court was supplementary information. The 11 convictions, the number for which the legal system ultimately found sufficient evidence to secure guilty verdicts, represented a fraction of the 39 he had claimed. This disparity has remained one of the case's most contested dimensions. Investigators who worked the case have generally maintained that the physical and forensic evidence was consistent with a much higher number of killings, and that the difficulties in securing additional convictions were rooted in the practical constraints of evidence preservation across a 3-year crime spree. Crime scenes that had been processed without the certainty of serial connection, ballistic records that had been handled without the awareness that they might belong to a pattern rather than isolated incidents, witnesses whose memories were complicated by time and the ordinary limitations of human recall under conditions of sudden violence and darkness. Defense counsel maintained, and continues to maintain, that their client was convicted of the crimes proven and not the ones merely confessed to in a compromised interrogation. The 39 he claimed, the 11 he was convicted of, somewhere in that gap live human beings whose deaths Gomez de Rocha may have caused but for whom the formal machinery of justice could not produce a verdict. People whose families live with the particular cruelty of a confession that the courts could not fully convert into accountability. Among those convicted cases, the youngest victim, the 14-year-old killed in January 2014, the one whose death sat at the end of a particularly concentrated period of killings in the final year of Gomez de Rocha's spree, carried a weight in the public consciousness of the case that even the staggering cumulative number of alleged victims could not diffuse. She had been walking. She had been 14. She had encountered a motorcycle on a street in a city where motorcycles were as ambient as birdsong, and she had become a number in a list that she never knew she was being added to. Her case became, in Brazilian media coverage and in the emotional architecture of the public's engagement with the Gomez de Rocha story, a kind of focal point. Not because her life mattered more than those of the homeless men, the sex workers, the gay men who had also been killed, but because her youth and the ordinariness of the moment of her death concentrated, in a single image, the full scope of what the city had been living with for 3 years. The monster on the motorcycle had not merely haunted the margins. He had come for anyone. He had come for a child walking on an ordinary afternoon in January. The psychological picture of Gomez de Rocha that emerged from evaluations conducted both before and during the legal proceedings was carefully discussed in the Brazilian press. The diagnosis of psychopathic personality traits, the constellation of emotional detachment, shallow affect, the absence of empathy in the functional neurological sense, the capacity to perform social normalcy as an overlay upon a completely different internal landscape, was not offered as mitigation. The evaluating psychologists were explicit and unanimous on the point that the Brazilian courts required. He was fully competent. He had known what he was doing. He had understood its wrongness. The psychopathy explained the mechanism but did not excuse the exercise of it. There was also the matter of the stated origin story. The childhood abuse at age 11, the neighbor, the moment that Gomez de Rocha himself claimed had fractured something foundational in him and set the trajectory of violence that eventually arrived at a body count of 39. This claim was not verifiable to investigators' satisfaction, and defense use of it was complicated by the fact that Gomez de Rocha offered it not with visible distress but with the same informational flatness that characterized his entire engagement with the legal proceedings. Whether it was true, whether it was constructed, whether it was a partial truth that his mind had reshaped into a more useful narrative, none of these questions could be definitively resolved. What it offered, if accurate, was not exoneration but context, the terrible, familiar context of how damage done to a child can become, decades later, damage done to the world, amplified and redirected and made lethal in ways that no one around the child ever recognized in time to intervene. Goiânia, in the aftermath of the case, did what cities do when they have been forced to confront an internal horror of this magnitude. Processed. Gradually and imperfectly, with the specific difficulty of communities that must continue to function within streets that are now permanently annotated by terrible knowledge. The corner where a woman was shot became a corner with a history. The bridge where homeless men had been killed became a bridge with a shadow underneath it. The parked car on Cedar Oeste, the street in January, the neighborhoods where the motorcycle had moved through the dark. They all carried forward the residue of what had happened in them, the way all places where extreme violence has occurred carry that residue, folded into the ordinary texture of daily life. The families of the victims navigated, as always, the most intimate and least publicly visible dimension of the aftermath. 39 claimed dead, 11 legally confirmed. Those 11 convictions came with a measure of formal closure, a verdict, a sentence, a record, that the families of the remaining 28 alleged victims did not fully receive. The confession existed. The legal acknowledgement was partial. The grief was total. Gomez de Rocha, born on the 4th of February 1988 in Goiânia, sat in the Odnir Guimarães Penitentiary, a maximum security facility that houses Brazil's most dangerous convicted offenders, and began what would be, under Brazilian law's 40-year effective cap, several decades of confinement. He was 26 at the time of his arrest. He would not leave prison as a young man. Whether he would ever leave prison at all was a question that the arithmetic of his sentence, his age, and the decades ahead placed firmly in the theoretical. There are cases that linger in the cultural consciousness of a place not because they are the largest or the most elaborately horrifying, but because they rupture a specific assumption. Because they locate the threat not in the stranger from elsewhere, not in the darkness at the edge of the map, but in the familiar face, the trusted uniform, the ordinary man on the ordinary motorcycle. Tiago Enrique Gomez de Rocha did not come from the shadows in any metaphorical sense. He came from the security booth and the shared house and the relationship and the ordinary, unremarkable life that he maintained, without visible strain, alongside the thing he was doing in the dark. That is the specific horror he leaves behind. Not the body count staggering as it is. Not the method brutal in its simplicity. Not even the coldness of the confession. The numbers 1 through 39 recited without trembling. What he leaves behind is the knowledge that ordinariness is not safety, that the most effective disguise a predator has ever worn is not a mask but a face that nobody thinks to look at twice. He lived among his neighbors. He protected, by profession, the people he worked alongside. He came home to his mother's house. And then, when the wait became intolerable, he took the motorcycle out, and the city paid the price for every minute it did not know his name. 39 times the city paid. 39 times, and then finally a stolen license plate, a bureaucratic file, a name in a database, and the slow, grinding machinery of consequence arriving at the door of the man who had believed, for 3 years, that he would never hear it knock. His name was Tiago Enrique Gomez de Rocha. They called him the Harvester of the Forgotten. And the city of Goiânia, Brazil, will not forget, because some shadows, once they are named, do not entirely leave. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Ward of Whispers. How Brazil's most prolific hospital predator, the man they called O Anjo de Morte, the debt collector of the dead, turned a healing ward into a private killing ground, one silent syringe at a time. AKA, the debt collector of the dead, the angel of death. He wore rubber gloves, carried a clipboard, and smiled at grieving families, while the poison was still warm inside the needle he had just emptied into their loved one's vein. Picture this. A public hospital in one of the most vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful cities on the planet, Rio de Janeiro. The corridors buzz with fluorescent light. Nurses move in practiced silence between beds. Machines breathe on behalf of people who cannot. Families sit in plastic chairs outside ward doors, clutching rosaries, whispering prayers, trusting, with every fragile fiber of their hope, that the people inside those walls are being protected, cared for, watched over. Now imagine that the man they trusted most, the one who checked the 4 lines, adjusted the oxygen flow, and leaned over unconscious patients in the dead of the night, was not saving lives. He was ending them, methodically, deliberately, one after another, and then, in the same breath, reaching for his phone to call the funeral home down the street so he could collect $60 for the referral before the body was even cold. Between January and May of 1999, just 124 days, investigators believe that Edson Isidoro Guimaraes, a quiet, unassuming nursing assistant at Salgado Filho Hospital, may have taken the lives of as many as 131 patients. Not in a dungeon, not in the shadows of some abandoned building, but in a modern medical facility, under humming white lights, surrounded by colleagues, in a ward full of people who trusted him completely. This is not the story of a monster who looked like one. This is the story of something far more terrifying, a killer who looked exactly like the person you would want standing beside you in your most vulnerable hour. A man who smelled like antiseptic, spoke in a low, calm voice, and carried death inside his breast pocket every single shift. This is the case of Edson Isidoro Guimaraes, known to some as the Nurse of Death, known to others as O Anjo de Morte, the Angel of Death. But for the purposes of this story, and everything you are about to learn, there is one name that captures the cold, calculated transaction that drove this man more precisely than any other, the debt collector of the dead. Stay with us, because what happened inside Ward 7 of Salgado Filho Hospital in 1999 is one of the most disturbing, most chilling, and most heartbreaking stories in the entire history of medical serial murder. And it all began, as so many terrible things do, with a man who simply did not get paid enough. There is a particular kind of invisibility that belongs to ordinary people in extraordinary positions of trust. The kind of invisibility that wraps around a man like a second skin when he has worked the same ward, spoken to the same colleagues, and walked the same linoleum corridors for 7 years without incident. Nobody questions the reliable one. Nobody pulls aside the familiar face. In a hospital as perpetually overwhelmed, as chronically underfunded, and as magnificently chaotic as Salgado Filho, a sprawling public institution sitting in the mayor district of Rio de Janeiro, that invisibility was as good as a license. Edson Isidoro Guimaraes was born in 1957 in Brazil, and by the time the final decade of the 20th century arrived, he had carved out something of a niche for himself in the medical support world. He was not a doctor. He was not even a fully credentialed nurse. He was a nursing assistant, what the Brazilians called an auxiliar de enfermagem, a position that placed him firmly in the supporting cast of the hospital's daily operation. He carried things. He administered things. He monitored things. He was part of the mechanical rhythm of a ward that processed the sick, the dying, and the desperate in an endless, relentless flow. Salgado Filho was one of Rio's largest public hospitals, and like so many large public hospitals in developing nations at the tail end of the 20th century, it operated on a razor's edge between function and collapse. Beds were overcrowded. Staff were overworked. Patients admitted to the ward where Guimaraes worked were frequently in critical condition. Some unconscious, some in medically induced comas, some simply waiting for a body that had decided to stop cooperating. The ward was not a place where miracles were expected. It was a place where families came to wait, and where the medical staff came to manage what could not be reversed. Guimaraes had spent 7 years threading through this environment. He knew the rhythms of the place better than most. He knew which shifts were busiest, which corners of the ward received the least foot traffic during the overnight hours, which patients were too far gone to cry out, and which families had stopped visiting entirely, leaving their loved ones adrift in a sea of beeping monitors with no one watching over them. He cataloged all of this, perhaps not consciously at first, perhaps not with intent, but the information accumulated in him like water behind a dam. To the people who worked alongside him, Edson was unremarkable in the best possible sense. He was described as quiet, steady, dependable in the way that a piece of furniture is dependable, always there, never troublesome, easy to stop seeing. He did not make grand gestures. He did not tell excessive stories in the break room. He showed up for his shifts, did what was asked of him, and went home. In a hospital where personality conflicts simmered constantly and burnout devoured the brightest staff in great hungry gulps, Guimarães was the one who simply persisted. But there was a parallel life running beneath the surface of this quiet competence, and it was one rooted not in medicine but in money. Rio de Janeiro's funeral industry, particularly in its more densely populated working-class districts, operated on a system of fierce, sometimes brutal competition at the end of the 1990s. Funeral homes scrambled for clients the way taxis scrambled for fares. Aggressively, hungrily, sometimes with outright desperation. And because hospitals were where deaths happened in the largest concentrations, it became standard practice for certain hospital workers, those with access to patient information, those who knew when a death had occurred before the paperwork caught up, to serve as informal referral agents. The moment a patient died, these workers would phone their contact at a funeral home, relay the name of the deceased and the family's details, and if the funeral home managed to secure the contract, the referring worker collected a payment. In 1999, that payment sat at roughly $60 per successful referral. $60. In a country where a nursing assistant's monthly wage barely covered the essentials, $60 for a single phone call was not nothing. It was a meal. It was a bus pass. It was the edge between comfort and strain. And for a man of Guimarães' temperament, methodical, calculating, unhurried, it was also an opportunity. He began notifying funeral homes of patient deaths. This much, at some point, seems to have been acknowledged even by his own account. He was not alone in this practice. The culture at Salgado Filho and at many similar institutions had normalized the referral system to the point where it blended into the background of hospital life. But Guimarães eventually arrived at a threshold that would separate him from every other opportunistic hospital worker who had ever made such a call. He arrived at the thought, the dark, irreversible, catastrophic thought, that if he was going to profit from death, then he was not entirely dependent on waiting for it to arrive on its own schedule. Nobody who knew him in those years could pinpoint the exact moment that thought became action. There was no sudden change in demeanor, no visible unraveling, no colleagues pulling supervisors aside to whisper about something they had seen that did not sit right. Guimarães continued to show up for his shifts with the same quiet reliability. He continued to speak in that low-level voice. He continued to move between beds with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this for nearly a decade. The only difference was that now, in the pocket of his uniform, he sometimes carried a loaded syringe. Potassium chloride. That was the instrument of his choice, a compound that exists legitimately in medical practice, used in carefully calibrated doses for specific therapeutic purposes, but which, when delivered in a concentrated, uncontrolled volume directly into a vein, produces a catastrophic and near-instantaneous shutdown of the cardiac system. The heart, overwhelmed by the sudden ionic disruption, seizes. It does not gradually slow. It does not wind down gracefully. It stops. Abruptly, completely, and in a person already weakened by illness, often without any outward sign that would distinguish the death from the natural progression of whatever condition had brought that patient to the ward in the first place. That was the genius of it, if genius is a word that can even be applied to something this abhorrent. In a ward full of critically ill patients, a sudden cardiac death was not unusual. It was expected. It was, in many cases, what the medical notes had already suggested was coming. A body that simply gave out in the middle of the night on a ward where bodies gave out regularly was not going to trigger an alarm. Certainly not when the death rate had been elevated for so long that it had started to blend into the statistics of the place. Just another grim data point in a hospital that saw too much and had too few resources to interrogate every number. He also employed a second method. Oxygen masks. In patients already struggling to breathe, already hovering at the boundary between life and the absence of it, removing the mask was a simpler, quieter act. No syringe required, no chemical trail to follow, just the slow, suffocating withdrawal of the one thing that was keeping the lungs moving, and then a return a few minutes later to discover what any passing colleague might have assumed was inevitable. What strikes investigators and criminologists who study this case is not just the brutality of the acts themselves, but the staggering frequency with which they occurred. Between the 1st of January and the 4th of May 1999, a span of just over 4 months, the death rate on Guimarães' ward climbed to a level that should, in retrospect, have triggered a formal institutional inquiry long before it did. Patients who had been admitted in serious but not immediately terminal condition were dying faster than the clinical picture suggested they should. The ward was accumulating fatalities with an almost rhythmic consistency that sat uncomfortably above statistical expectation. But hospitals in Rio de Janeiro in 1999, particularly public hospitals running on government budgets that were never quite sufficient, were not well equipped for the kind of systematic data analysis that might have connected those numbers to a single source. There were too many patients, too many variables, too many legitimate reasons for high mortality in an intensive care environment. The numbers were troubling, but troubling numbers had explanations. They always did. And nobody, not a supervisor, not a senior nurse, not a department head, paused long enough to ask whether the explanation this time was standing right there among them in a white uniform. In the dark quiet of those overnight shifts, Edson Guimarães moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had found a system that worked. He would select his patient with what he later described as a form of clinical reasoning. Patients in irreversible comas, patients with no realistic pathway to recovery, patients whose families had stopped coming, patients whose suffering he claimed to find intolerable. He would wait until the corridor was clear. He would draw the compound into the syringe with the practiced ease of a man who had performed the motion 1,000 times in legitimate contexts. And then he would approach the bedside, and he would complete the act, and the machine beside the bed would begin its high-pitched, single-note alarm, and Guimarães would move to the next task as though nothing had happened. And then, sometimes, he would reach for his phone. What makes this case sit differently in the stomach than almost any other medical serial killer case is that duality, the death on one side of the coin and the transaction on the other. The grief he deliberately manufactured became the commodity he immediately monetized. Somewhere across the city, a funeral home representative would answer the call, jot down a name, and prepare to dispatch a vehicle. And somewhere in a waiting room outside the ward, a family that had gone home for the night trusting that their person was being cared for would receive a phone call that told them to come back, that it was over, that nothing more could be done. For 124 days, this was the rhythm of his world, and almost no one noticed. There is a common assumption, when people imagine a serial killer operating inside a medical institution, that the crimes must have been difficult to commit, that the proximity of colleagues, the presence of monitoring equipment, the inherent transparency of ward life would make such acts nearly impossible to sustain without detection. This assumption is wrong. And the case of Edson Isidoro Guimarães, the debt collector of the dead, dismantles it with horrifying thoroughness. The first thing to understand about the environment in which Guimarães operated is that Salgado Filho Hospital in 1999 was, by any measure, overwhelmed. Rio de Janeiro's public health system at the close of the 20th century was strained to the point of rupture. Salgado Filho served one of the city's most densely populated districts. Mayor, a working-class neighborhood where families lived tightly packed into apartment buildings that pressed against each other like teeth in an overcrowded jaw. The hospital absorbed the illnesses, the accidents, the cardiac events, the late-stage diseases, and the trauma cases of an enormous population. Its wards were full. Its staff were stretched. Its administrative infrastructure was designed for a patient load that had long since been surpassed. In this environment, the intensive care and critical care wards were the most volatile. Patients arrived in states of extreme medical compromise. Prognoses were uncertain. Treatment was sometimes palliative rather than curative, focused on managing pain and maintaining basic function rather than pursuing any realistic path to recovery. Death was not a failure in this context, it was an expected outcome. When a patient died on one of these wards, the clinical staff processed it as part of the terrible but ordinary mechanics of their work. There was paperwork. There was a moment of professional acknowledgement. And then the next patient needed attention. Guimarães understood this culture intimately, and he exploited it with a precision that suggests years of unconscious preparation. He knew that a death on his shift would not, in itself, raise an eyebrow. He knew that the attending physician who signed the death certificate was rarely the same physician who had been managing the patient's care. The night shift operated with a different team, one that relied heavily on the documentation left by the day staff. He knew that a death attributed to cardiac arrest in a patient already suffering from a compromised cardiac system was almost self-certifying. The cause of death was right there in the admissions paperwork. He also understood the pharmaceutical landscape of the ward with the thoroughness of someone who had spent years watching how medications were stored, accessed, and accounted for. Potassium chloride in concentrated form was not an unusual substance to find in an intensive care environment. It had legitimate applications. It was not the kind of compound that would trigger an automatic audit if a small quantity went unaccounted for, particularly in a setting where inventory management was already underfunded and understaffed. Guimarães did not need to smuggle anything into the hospital. The weapon was already there. He simply had to know where to find it, and he did. The mechanics of the injection itself were almost insultingly simple for a man of his training and experience. Drawing a substance into a syringe, locating in 4-line, introducing the substance into the line. These were acts he performed dozens of times per shift in the normal course of his work. The physical motion of administering potassium chloride to a patient in a lethal dose was, from the outside, indistinguishable from the physical motion of administering any other medication. There was no violence. There was no struggle, not in a patient who was already unconscious. There was no sound. There was simply the depression of a plunger, the quiet withdrawal of a needle, and then the waiting measured in seconds, not minutes. The cardiac consequence of a concentrated potassium chloride injection is both rapid and irreversible. The compound floods the bloodstream and immediately disrupts the electrochemical balance that governs heart function. The muscle walls of the heart, suddenly overwhelmed by the ionic surge, enter a state of uncoordinated spasm called ventricular fibrillation, a condition in which the heart quivers rather than beats, unable to pump blood, unable to sustain life. In a healthy person, this would trigger the most extreme medical emergency response available. In a critically ill patient already on a monitor that was already alarming periodically for other reasons, in a ward where the staff were already stretched too thin to respond to every alert with the same immediacy, the alarm was just another alarm. Until it was not. He also removed oxygen masks. This method was, in its own way, even more devastating in its simplicity. There are patients in intensive care who exist in a precise, terrible equilibrium. Their lungs cannot sustain independent function, but with supplemental oxygen delivered continuously through a mask or tubing, they can be maintained. Removing the mask was not a violent act. There were no marks. There was no disruption to the patient's surroundings. It required nothing more than a hand reaching forward, fingers closing around the edge of the mask, and a single, calm motion, and then stepping back and waiting. Guimarães later confirmed that he had used this method on multiple patients. He told reporters without apparent distress that the oxygen masks had been removed from at least 5 individuals. 5 was the number he initially admitted to, but the investigators who began examining the ward's death records after his arrest were confronted with a figure that made 5 sound almost quaint. The mortality statistics for Guimarães' ward over those 4 months, January through May of 1999, were extraordinary in their elevation above baseline expectation. When investigators began compiling the numbers, cross-referencing the shifts Guimarães had worked with the patients who had died during those shifts, a pattern emerged that was as unmistakable as it was nauseating. The ward had, during the periods when Guimarães was present, experienced death at a rate that defied every reasonable clinical explanation. The total suspected victim count eventually settled, provisionally, grimly, at 131. 131 human beings. Each of them admitted to a hospital in a state of vulnerability. Each of them placed in the care of people trusted to protect them. Each of them connected, somewhere in the world outside those walls, to someone who loved them. A child, a parent, a sibling, a friend who did not know that the last time they said goodbye in that ward corridor was the actual last time. That the hours or days they had been promised were being actively reduced by the hands of someone walking the ward in a uniform. But what drove him? That question gnawed at investigators, at journalists, at psychologists who studied the case in its aftermath. and it produces an answer that is both more mundane and more disturbing than anything a purely psychological profile might suggest. There were two motors running inside Edson Guimaraes, and they were not entirely in sync. The first was financial. The funeral home referral system, that $60 transaction, provided a material incentive that was at least partially responsible for what happened. Rio's secretary for public security at the time, Josias Quintal, offered a blunt assessment. Guimaraes may have started killing to generate referral fees and then simply lost control of the process. Started with calculation, and somewhere along the way the calculation became compulsion, became routine, became normalcy. The $60 was the ignition, but once the engine was running, it did not need the same fuel anymore. The second motor was a self-constructed moral framework that Guimaraes had built around his actions, a framework that he articulated with a composure that was, in many ways, more chilling than any show of remorse would have been. He told investigators and later told a television reporter that he had not selected victims at random. He had, in his own telling, chosen patients who were beyond recovery, patients in irreversible comas, patients with AIDS in advanced stages, patients whom the medical evidence suggested had no meaningful path forward. He described himself not as a predator, but as a pragmatist, someone who was simply acknowledging and acting upon what nature and medicine were already in the process of concluding. He was not ending lives in this telling. He was abbreviating suffering. He was, in the language he preferred, doing what had to be done. "I am at peace," he told reporters. Because the patients were in a coma and had no way of recovering, that sentence deserves to sit with you for a moment. Because it reveals something critical about the psychology of medical serial killers who construct a merciful self-image, a pattern visible across multiple cases spanning multiple countries and multiple decades. The framework of mercy becomes a license. Once a person has convinced themselves that they are acting not from cruelty but from compassion, the internal governor that might otherwise limit or halt the behavior is dismantled. There is no guilt to manage because in the killer's internal narrative, there is no crime. There is only service, only relief, only the merciful shortening of an outcome that was already inevitable. This is what made Guimaraes so dangerous across those 124 days. He was not operating under the pressure of concealed shame. He was not fighting an internal conflict that might eventually surface and betray him. He was calm. He was at peace. He went home after his shifts without the corrosive weight of guilt eating at his sleep. He returned the next morning, collected his uniform, and went back to work. Meanwhile, across the city, families were burying people who should have had more time. The patterns in the death records were becoming impossible to attribute to coincidence, even in a hospital too overwhelmed to act on them quickly. The ward's mortality rate was not simply elevated, it was consistently, specifically elevated during the periods when a particular nursing assistant was present. When Guimaraes was off shift, the numbers softened. When he returned, they climbed again. The data was there, waiting to be read. And eventually, the death toll grew large enough to become impossible to explain away. But it was not a data analyst who brought Edson Isidoro Guimaraes down. It was not an audit. It was not a pattern recognition algorithm or a proactive investigation by a concerned administrator. It was something far simpler, far more human, and in many ways far more profound. It was a single pair of eyes. One person in one corridor at one specific moment who saw what was happening and refused to look away. What that person witnessed and what it set in motion is where this story reaches its fulcrum. The day the curtain finally came down on the ward where 131 people may have been killed without a single alarm being raised. The day Edson Guimaraes filled a syringe for the last time. That day was May 4th, 1999. May 4th, 1999 arrived at Salgado Filho Hospital the way most days arrive there, with the low industrial hum of a building already in full motion before the sunrise had properly established itself. Trolleys moving, monitors chirping, the antiseptic smell of the corridors hanging in the air like a presence. Staff moving between tasks with the particular efficiency of people who have learned to silence whatever internal noise might otherwise slow them down. It was an ordinary morning in an extraordinary place, and the person who would change everything about what happened there that day was not a detective or a doctor or a specially trained investigator. He was a hospital porter. His name was not widely publicized in the aftermath of the case. Some accounts refer to him only by role, as though the specifics of his identity were less important than the enormity of the act itself. In many ways, that anonymity serves a kind of quiet justice. What he did that morning required no particular expertise. It required no advanced training. It required only the willingness to trust the evidence of his own eyes and to act on what they told him, even in an environment where the culture of institutional deference might have encouraged him to rationalize away what he had seen. What he saw was this: Edson Guimarães, moving with his customary unhurried calm beside the bed of a comatose patient, drawing a substance into a syringe, and then bending forward to administer it. The patient, already unconscious, offered no resistance. The act took only seconds, and the monitor beside the bed, which had been registering the patient's vital signs with the imperfect but persistent rhythm of a struggling system, changed its tone abruptly and conclusively. The patient died immediately. The porter did not confront Guimarães. He did not shout. He did not create a scene in the ward that might have alerted others and given the subject time to construct a version of events. He walked away from what he had seen, and then he went directly to a supervisor and told them what he had witnessed. Every detail, every element of what he had observed, clearly, specifically, without embellishment or interpretation. Just the facts of what had happened beside that bed. The supervisor contacted the hospital administration. The administration contacted the police. And within hours, the architecture of Edson Guimarães' secret began, for the first time in its 4-month existence, to develop cracks. When police arrived at Salgado Filho, their initial inquiry was focused narrowly on the incident the porter had reported. A nursing assistant observed administering what appeared to be an unauthorized injection to a comatose patient who then died. That was the allegation. That was the scope of what needed to be investigated. But almost immediately, a secondary conversation began, one that the hospital's administrators had perhaps been reluctant to initiate on their own terms, but which the presence of law enforcement made unavoidable. The conversation about the numbers. Because when investigators began pulling the mortality statistics for the ward in question and comparing them against historical baselines, and then against the rosters to identify which staff members had been present during periods of elevated death rates, the picture that emerged was not the picture of an isolated incident. It was the picture of a systematic, sustained, and catastrophically prolific pattern of killing that stretched back to the first day of January of that same year. For months, 124 days, a death toll that investigators would ultimately believe might be as high as 131 people, though that figure carried with it the caveat that forensic verification was extraordinarily difficult given the circumstances. Most of the patients had been cremated or buried without autopsies, their deaths documented as natural progressions of their existing medical conditions. Proving a lethal injection in a body that had been interred for months, in a legal and forensic system that had not anticipated the need to go back and examine those deaths retrospectively, was a task of nearly impossible dimensions. Guimarães was taken in for questioning. What followed was, by any standard, one of the more extraordinary interrogation narratives in the history of Brazilian criminal justice. Because Edson Guimarães did not, upon being confronted with the evidence, attempt to deny everything and retreat behind a wall of silence. He did not contact a lawyer and refuse to speak. He did not construct an elaborate alternative account of events designed to place him elsewhere or provide innocent explanations for what had been observed. He confessed, not to 131 murders. He would never acknowledge that number, and the legal system would ultimately never hold him accountable for anything approaching it. But to 5 patients, he told investigators, whose lives he had deliberately ended. 5 people who had been in irreversible comas, who had no pathway back to consciousness or recovery, whose families were suffering in the waiting rooms outside the ward, whose continued existence on life support was, in his framing, a cruelty masquerading as care. He delivered this confession without visible distress. Investigators and journalists who were present for or received detailed accounts of the confession process described a man who spoke about the deaths with a composed, almost clinical detachment, as though he were providing a clinical debrief rather than an account of fatal acts he had deliberately performed. He did not weep. He did not stumble over his words. He did not display the behavioral markers that investigators typically associate with guilt or grief or the psychological weight of admitted killing. And then, before his trial had even been scheduled, he sat down with a television journalist and said, on camera, in words that would be broadcast across Brazil and reported internationally, "I don't regret what I did. I did it to those in irreversible comas and whose families were suffering." That interview electrified the country. In a nation already processing the shock of a nurse accused of killing dozens of patients in a major public hospital, the spectacle of that same nurse sitting calmly before a camera and expressing neither remorse nor hesitation produced a reaction of collective disbelief. Brazil had seen violent crime. It had seen political scandal. It had seen catastrophic institutional failures. But this, a man in a medical uniform, speaking with the quiet conviction of someone describing a charitable act, while the death count behind him potentially stretched into the hundreds, was something that did not fit neatly into any existing category. The investigators pressed forward. They were working against formidable obstacles. The fact that most suspected victims had been disposed of through cremation or burial before any investigation was underway, the institutional reluctance of a hospital to expose the full extent of what had occurred within its walls, the forensic limitations of a legal system working with incomplete physical evidence. The documentation trail they could construct was incomplete. The witness they could produce was singular, the porter who had observed the final injection. Additional corroborating witnesses from within the ward staff were difficult to secure, either because people genuinely had not seen anything sufficiently specific to constitute legal testimony, or because the culture of the institution made coming forward feel professionally and personally perilous. The investigation also had to contend with the secondary dimension of the case, the funeral home connection. Investigators confirmed that Guimarães had indeed been collecting referral fees from at least one funeral home in the vicinity of the hospital. The $60 per death arrangement was real. Phone records indicated contact between Guimarães and funeral home personnel on multiple occasions that correlated with patient deaths on his ward. This did not constitute proof that financial motive had driven individual killings, but it provided a coherent, documented framework that supported the prosecution's argument about motive and pattern. The hospital itself was thrown into a crisis that would take years to fully reckon with. Flavio Silveira, the administrator of Salgado Filho, made a statement to the press that attempted to draw a distinction between what Guimarães had done and the more internationally recognized model of medical euthanasia, noting pointedly that whatever Guimarães' claimed motives, his willingness to profit from the deaths he caused removed any pretense of purely merciful intent. Silveira was quoted as saying, bluntly, that Guimarães had claimed to want to shorten suffering while also wanting to make some money on the side. That formulation, suffering as both justification and profit source, is perhaps the most precise encapsulation of the moral grotesqueness at the center of this case. Because even if one were to engage, for the sake of argument, with the most charitable possible interpretation of Guimarães' framing, the idea that he genuinely believed he was relieving intolerable suffering, the moment that belief was coupled with a financial transaction, the moment the death of the person in the bed became both a merciful act and a $60 referral fee, the mercy argument collapsed entirely. Mercy and monetization cannot coexist in the same gesture. One negates the other. The case built slowly but inevitably toward trial. Investigators had the porter's eyewitness account. They had the confession. They had the statistical anomaly of the ward's death rate. They had the funeral home connection. They had Guimarães' own televised words. What they did not have, what the legal system could not, in the end, fully construct, was the forensic foundation to prosecute for anything approaching the full suspected body count. In a functioning modern forensic investigation, the discovery of a pattern of killings on a hospital ward would trigger a systematic exhumation and autopsy process designed to identify chemical signatures of unauthorized substances in preserved tissue. Potassium chloride, administered in a lethal dose, does leave markers, elevated serum potassium levels, specific patterns of cardiac damage that a skilled pathologist can identify under the right conditions. But those conditions require preserved, relatively recent remains, access to the body, and the institutional resources to conduct large-scale forensic examinations. In this case, the window for such examinations had largely closed before the investigation began in earnest. What the prosecution was left with was powerful but bounded. And so, when the trial of Edson Isidoro Guimarães opened in the first months of the year 2000, it did so in the shadow of a number 131 that the courtroom could not reach. The Brazilian courtroom that received the case of Edson Isidoro Guimarães in the early days of 2000 was a space that carried the weight of something almost too large for its walls to contain. Outside, the story had become a national conversation. About the hospital system, about oversight, about the vulnerability of the sick and unconscious, about whether something so catastrophic could have been prevented and how many layers of institutional failure had made it possible. Inside, the legal machinery was narrower, more constrained, and ultimately less satisfying than the scale of the horror that had been alleged demanded. On February 21, 2000, the court delivered its verdict. Edson Isidoro Guimarães was found guilty of the murders of 4 patients. For, not 5, the number he had confessed to, not 131, the number that investigators suspected. For provable, legally cognizable murders, for which the evidence was sufficiently documented and forensically supported to sustain a conviction beyond the standard required in Brazilian criminal proceedings. The sentence handed down was 76 years in prison. 76 years. It is a number that provokes a complicated emotional response when you hold it against the other number, 131. 76 years feels, in the arithmetic of justice, absurdly inadequate when measured against a suspected body count that would place Guimarães among the most prolific medical serial killers in recorded history. And yet the sentence was not the product of indifference or corruption. It was the product of a legal system doing what legal systems are designed to do, convicting on what can be proven, not on what can be suspected, not on what seems overwhelmingly likely, not even on what the accused has suggested in casual televised conversation. This is one of the defining tensions of this case, and it is one that sits unresolved in the aftermath with a particular gnawing discomfort. Because in this case, the gap between what was proven and what was suspected is not a gap of a few deaths. It is a gap of over 100 human beings. A gap that contains, somewhere within it, the almost certainly true but legally unverifiable story of more than 100 patients who were alive when they should have continued to be alive, who had already been through the harrowing process of falling critically ill, of being admitted to a hospital, of surrendering their most fundamental vulnerabilities to a system they could not navigate on their own, and who were then, in the silence of the overnight ward, deprived of whatever additional days or weeks their bodies might have been able to provide. What happened to Guimarães after the verdict is a question that the public record answers only in fragments. He was taken to serve his sentence within the Brazilian prison system. Given his age at the time of conviction, he was 42 when arrested, and the sentence length, the mathematics of incarceration suggested a very long confinement. Brazilian law and prison conditions in the early 2000s did not provide the kind of comfortable trajectory that might make a 76-year sentence feel symbolic rather than real. The hospital where the killings occurred was never the same. Salgado Filho survived. It was too essential to the community it served to close, but it underwent a period of administrative scrutiny and internal restructuring that exposed just how many layers of oversight failure had allowed the situation to persist for as long as it had. The mortality monitoring systems were reviewed. The protocols around medication access and accounting were tightened. The informal referral culture, that arrangement with funeral homes that had both predated and partially enabled Guimarães' actions, was formally acknowledged and formally condemned. But acknowledging failures after the fact and restructuring processes in the aftermath of catastrophe does not restore what was lost. It does not reach backward into those 124 days and undo them. It does not find the 127 families, the ones beyond the 4 legally acknowledged victims, and give them a courtroom moment, a verdict, a sentence. Those families lived and still live in a different kind of knowing, the knowing that is not proof but is also not doubt, the kind of knowing that exists in the space between the statistics and the law, and that no legal proceeding can ever fully address. The case of Edson Isidoro Guimarães became, and remains, one of the most referenced examples in the academic and criminological literature on medical serial killers. A body of research has grown up around the specific dynamics that make hospitals vulnerable to this type of predation, and Guimarães' case features prominently in it. The factors identified: institutional overcrowding, inadequate mortality monitoring, the normalization of high death rates in critical care settings, the absence of mandatory systematic cross-referencing between staff presence and patient fatality rates, the cultural deference to medical authority that makes internal whistleblowing extraordinarily difficult, are factors that existed in 1999 Rio de Janeiro and that continue to exist in varying degrees in hospitals around the world today. There is a paper published in the years following the case that specifically addresses the challenge of detecting medically facilitated killings in high-volume critical care environments, and it uses the Guimarães case as its central illustration. The argument it makes is both urgent and profoundly uncomfortable: that the very qualities that make critical care wards necessary, the concentration of the most vulnerable patients, the reliance on advanced pharmaceutical and technological interventions, the normalization of frequent and sudden death, are the same qualities that make them extraordinarily difficult to police against a determined insider with both the access and the patience to exploit the environment. The paper recommends, among other things, mandatory statistical analysis of mortality rates cross-referenced by individual staff presence, random pharmaceutical audits, and structural protections for internal whistleblowers. These are reasonable recommendations. They have been, in the decades since, adopted in varying degrees by hospitals in various countries. Sometimes driven by the Guimarães case specifically, sometimes by the separate and equally harrowing cases of other medical killers whose names and methods and victim counts make the landscape of this particular category of violent crime resemble a map that should not exist. What the Guimarães case adds to that landscape that sets it somewhat apart, beyond the scale of the suspected victim count, is the moral argument at its center. Because Guimarães was not, by any clinical definition, a psychopath in the traditional sense. He did not exhibit the disorganized, thrill-seeking, sexually motivated patterns that dominate the cultural imagination of the serial killer. He did not pursue escalating violence for its own sake. He did not, apparently, experience the killings as exciting or pleasurable in any conventional sense. What he experienced was something that he described, repeatedly and consistently, as peace, calmness, the conviction that he had done the right thing. And that is arguably far more terrifying, because the monster that wears the face of certainty, the killer who has not merely escaped guilt but has philosophically annihilated the possibility of it, is a creature that our standard alarm systems are not designed to catch. We watch for agitation. We watch for behavioral changes. We watch for the cracks that guilt produces. We do not always know how to watch for the smooth, unmarked surface of a man who genuinely believes he has committed no wrong. The conscience that has reframed itself as a virtue is the conscience that will not betray its owner. And in a hospital ward in Rio de Janeiro in the first 4 months of 1999, that conscienceless calm was the most dangerous thing in the building. What we are left with at the end of this story is a question that has no comfortable answer and no legal resolution. How many of those 131 suspected victims were, in fact, victims? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The honest answer is that the evidence strongly suggests most of them were. The honest answer is also that the legal system, which is the instrument we have built for these situations, imperfect and constrained and bounded as it is, could only take us as far as for names with legal standing, for deaths that could be proven, for families who received, in February of the year 2000, a verdict that said, yes, this happened, he did this, and he will be held to account for it. The others received only statistics, suspicions, the cold arithmetic of anomaly without the warmth of formal acknowledgement. Somewhere in Rio de Janeiro, in the years that followed, people lived with the knowledge that their parent, their grandparent, their spouse, admitted to Salgado Filho in the early months of 1999, deteriorated quickly, gone before anyone expected, might have been one of them, might have been one of the uncounted. They had no courtroom, no verdict, no sentencing, just the number and the silence and the particular grief of knowing something that cannot be fully proven and therefore cannot be fully closed. That is the cruelest wound this case leaves. Not the 76 years in prison, though that sentence is real and significant. Not even the 131. It is the knowledge that somewhere beyond the four, beyond what the law could touch, the true accounting of Edson Isidoro Guimaraes, the debt collector of the dead, remains permanently, irrevocably open. He told a television reporter before his trial that he felt no regret, that he was at peace. The question this case leaves for the rest of us is far simpler, far more human, and far harder to answer. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.